Hello everyone, and welcome back to Nightmare Narratives. I can picture some of you already in bed, maybe some of you just getting home from work. Wherever you are, whatever time it is, I'm glad you're here. If this helps you relax or sleep, please like and subscribe. It means a lot. Now, let's get you comfortable, and I'll tell you tonight's story. My name is Jeremiah Blackthorne, and I've been a park ranger in Shenandoah National Park for 17 years. I'm telling you this story because I need you to understand something important about the mountains. They're not just pretty rocks and trees like the tourists think. There are places up here where things live that shouldn't exist, and Devil's Backbone Ridge is one of them. I was born in these mountains, same as my daddy and his daddy before him. My father worked the coal mines until a cave-in took my younger brother Tommy when I was 26. That's when I decided I'd rather spend my life helping people get out of dark places instead of going into them. Funny how things work out. By October of 1962, I knew every trail, every creek, and every cave entrance in my section of the park. I'd mapped over 200 caves in the limestone ridge country, some going down 40 miles or more. The old-timers called it Devil's Backbone because the jagged rocks looked like a giant spine sticking up from the earth. My grandmother used to tell stories about empty people who lived in the deep caves, folks who'd traded their souls for something dark. I always figured it was just mountain talk. That was before I met them. It started on a cold Tuesday morning in late October. The frost warnings had been coming in all week, and fog rolled through the valleys like smoke. I was drinking coffee at the ranger station when the call came in. 3 college kids from Virginia Tech had gone spelunking in a newly discovered cave system near the backbone. They were supposed to check in by radio every 4 hours. It had been 12. The missing spelunkers were experienced cavers, not weekend tourists. That worried me more than if they'd been beginners. Smart people don't just vanish in caves, they know how to navigate. But caves don't care how smart you are. One wrong step, one loose rock, and you're just another body waiting to be found. I loaded my gear into the truck: rope, carbide lamps, first aid kit, and enough food for 2 days. The cave they'd been exploring was 15 miles from the nearest road, deep in the back country where radio signals died and cell phones were useless. If something had gone wrong, we'd be on our own until we could hike back for help. The drive up the mountain road took 45 minutes, winding through forests so thick the morning sun barely touched the ground. I'd made this trip dozens of times for rescues, but something felt different that day. The woods were too quiet. No bird songs, no squirrel chatter, just the rumble of my truck engine and the crunch of leaves under the tires. I parked at the trailhead and shouldered my pack. The hike to the cave entrance would take 2 hours through rough country. As I walked, I noticed things that made my skin crawl. No animal tracks in the mud. No insects buzzing around. Even the wind seemed afraid to make noise. The cave entrance sat in a natural amphitheater of limestone cliffs, a dark mouth about 6 feet high and 10 feet wide. I'd been here 3 times before to map the initial passages. It was a typical Appalachian cave. Lots of narrow squeezes leading to larger chambers, underground streams, and passages that went deeper than anyone had fully explored. What I found outside the cave made my blood run cold. The missing students' gear was arranged in a perfect circle near the entrance, not scattered like you'd expect from people in a hurry or panic, not piled up like they'd stopped for lunch. Arranged. 3 backpacks, 3 helmets, 3 coils of rope, all placed exactly the same distance apart, like someone had used a compass to measure. I called out their names. "Sarah! Mike! David!" My voice echoed into the darkness, but nothing came back, not even the usual sounds caves make: dripping water, wind through passages, the flutter of bat wings. Just silence so complete it made my ears ring. That's when I should have hiked back for help. Should have called in a full rescue team with better equipment and more people. But 17 years of cave rescues had taught me that time was everything underground. Every hour those kids were missing, their chances got worse. I lit my carbide lamp and checked my rope. The flame burned steady and bright in the still air. At least the cave wasn't filling with bad gas. I tied off my safety line and started into the darkness, following the chalk marks the students had left on the walls to mark their path. Had no idea I was walking into hell. Others in the region, a narrow passage that opened into a larger chamber after about 50 feet. The students' chalk marks were clear and regular, showing they'd followed proper caving procedure. But as I went deeper, I noticed something wrong with my equipment. My carbide lamp was burning too bright, like the flame was feeding on something besides acetylene gas. The light seemed to bend at the edges, creating shadows that moved when they shouldn't. I checked my compass and watched the needle spin in slow circles, unable to find magnetic north. I told myself, iron ore could mess with a compass, and limestone caves were full of strange chemistry. There had to be a logical explanation for everything I was seeing. The first handprint changed my mind about logic. I found it on the wall about 300 feet into the cave, pressed into soft clay beside one of the students' chalk marks. It was human-sized, but wrong somehow. The fingers were too long, and there was no thumbprint. Just 4 elongated marks, like something with very thin fingers had pressed against the wall. Then I found another, and another. The handprints led deeper into the cave, following a passage the students hadn't marked. Fresh prints, still damp to the touch. But the strangest thing wasn't the prints themselves, it was how many there were. Dozens of them, covering both walls of the passage, like a crowd of people had been walking through with their hands pressed against the stone. Some of the prints were bigger than human hands should be. Some were so small they could have belonged to children. All of them had that same wrong shape, 4 fingers, no thumb, pressed deep into clay that should have been rock hard after thousands of years. I followed the handprints for what felt like hours, but was probably 30 minutes. The passage sloped steadily downward, taking me deeper into the mountain than the maps showed. My altimeter read depths that shouldn't have been possible. According to my instruments, I was now below sea level, which was impossible in a mountain cave system. That's when I heard the voices. Whispered conversations echoing from somewhere ahead, too faint to make out words, but clearly human. I called out again. "Sarah! Mike! David! Can you hear me?" The whispers stopped. Bandwidth, the silence that followed, was worse than the sounds. It felt like the mountain itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what I'd do next. I pressed forward, my lamp flame flickering in air that had suddenly turned ice cold. The temperature drop hit me like a physical blow. In the span of 10 steps, the cave went from cool dampness to freezing cold that made my breath fog. My fingers went numb inside my gloves. Frost began forming on the walls, despite the fact that there was no air movement to cause such a sudden change. I found the students' first piece of abandoned equipment in a side chamber that hadn't existed on any of my previous maps. Sarah's helmet, sitting upright on a flat rock, like someone had carefully placed it there. Her headlamp was still on, beam pointing at the ceiling, battery somehow still strong after 12 hours. Next to the helmet was something that made me question my own eyes. A footprint in the cave floor, pressed into solid limestone as if the rock had been soft mud. Human-shaped but stretched, like someone had walked on feet that were too long for their body. Principles. I picked up the helmet and examined it closely. No cracks, no blood, no sign of struggle. Sarah had simply taken it off and left it behind. But why? And how had someone, or something, left a footprint in solid rock? The whispers started again, coming from multiple directions now. Conversations in what sounded like English, but spoken so softly I couldn't understand the words. Male voices, female voices, old and young, all talking at once in a murmur that seemed to come from the walls themselves. I drew my service pistol and called out in my strongest voice, "This is Park Ranger Blackthorn. If anyone can hear me, respond now." The whispers stopped again. Then something laughed, a sound like dry leaves rustling that seemed to come from right behind my ear. I spun around, gun raised, but found only empty cave passage stretching into darkness. My radio crackled to life for the first time since entering the cave. Through the static, I heard Deputy Ranger Thomas Whitehawk's voice. "Blackthorn, you copy? Found your truck at the trailhead. What's your status?" "Tom, thank God. I'm about a half-mile into the system, following strange tracks. The students' gear is scattered, but no sign of the kids themselves. Something's not right down here." "Copy that. I'm geared up and heading your way. Should reach the entrance in 30 minutes. "Negative," I said, probably too quickly. "This cave system isn't on any of our maps. It's dangerous and unstable. I need you to stay outside and coordinate with base camp." But the radio had already gone dead, leaving me alone with the whispers that had started up again, closer now and definitely following me as I moved deeper into the mountain. I should have turned back right then, should have waited for proper backup and equipment. But somewhere in the darkness ahead, 3 young people were counting on me to find them. And after 17 years of bringing folks home safe from these mountains, I wasn't about to stop now. On the walls had multiplied, covering every surface I could see. Some were pressed so deep into the stone, they looked like they'd been made in soft clay. Others seemed to glow with their own pale light, though that might have been tricks of my carbide flame. I followed them deeper into Devil's Backbone, not knowing I was walking towards something that had been waiting in the dark for over 100 years. The passage opened into a chamber larger than anything on the official cave maps. My carbide lamp couldn't reach the ceiling or the far walls. The whispers echoed from every direction, like dozens of people having quiet conversations just out of sight. Handprints covered everything here: walls, floor, even the ceiling overhead. They overlapped and swirled in patterns that hurt to look at, like someone had been trying to write a message in a language made of palm prints and finger marks. I found Mike's backpack sitting in the exact center of the chamber, contents scattered in another perfect circle. His food, water bottles, extra batteries, and climbing gear had been arranged with the same precise spacing I'd seen outside the cave. No signs of struggle, no blood, just methodical placement, like everything had been set up for some kind of ceremony. That's when Deputy Whitehawk's voice echoed from the passage behind me. "Jerry! Where the hell are you?" I turned toward the sound, relief flooding through me. "Down here, Tom. Follow my voice." But as his headlamp beam appeared in the passage entrance, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. Tom was walking wrong. His usual confident stride had been replaced by jerky, unnatural movements, like someone learning how to operate his legs for the first time. "Tom," I called out, "you okay?" He stepped into the chamber, and I saw his face in the lamplight. It was Tom. Definitely Tom. Same weathered features, same greying beard, same brown eyes I'd known for 8 years. But something was missing. Some spark or life that had always been there was just gone. "Found some strange things on the way down," he said in a voice that sounded like Tom but felt wrong somehow. "Lots of handprints, voices in the walls. You hear them too?" "Yeah, I hear them. We need to get out of here and call for a full rescue team. This cave system is unstable and there's something—" Tom's headlamp went out. Not died like a dead battery, just clicked off, leaving us standing in the circle of my carbide flame. In the sudden darkness beyond my light, the whispers grew louder. Clear enough now to understand words. "Come deeper. Come home. Come to us." "Tom, turn your light back on." "Battery's good," he said in that flat voice. "Light just won't work down here. Nothing electrical works right in the deep places." I played my lamp beam across his face and nearly dropped it. Tom's eyes reflected the light like an animal's, a pale, sickly glow that definitely wasn't normal. When he smiled, I could see all his teeth, more teeth than a human mouth should hold. "We should keep going," he said. "The students went deeper, much deeper. They're waiting for us." I backed toward the far side of the chamber, keeping my gun ready but not pointing it at Tom yet. Maybe the cave gases were affecting his behavior. Maybe the stress of the rescue was getting to him. Maybe there was still a logical explanation for everything I was seeing. Then I heard the ropes snap. Parliamentary crack echoed from the passage we'd entered through, like someone had cut a thick rope with a knife. My safety line, the rope connecting me to the outside world, had been severed. We were trapped in the chamber, with no way to retrace our path in the maze of passages. "Funny thing about these old caves," Tom said, still smiling that too wide smile. "Sometimes they don't want you to leave. Sometimes they need you to stay." Berkshire around us grew into clear voices now, dozens of them speaking in perfect unison. "Join us. Stay with us. Become empty like us." I raised my pistol and pointed it at Tom, or the thing wearing Tom's face. "What did you do with Deputy Whitehawk?" "I am Whitehawk," it said, tilting its head like a curious bird. "I'm just improved, made better, made empty so there's room for what needs to be filled." It took a step toward me, and I saw that its feet weren't quite touching the ground. It was floating an inch above the cave floor, moving with the jerky motions of a puppet on strings. "The students found us 3 days ago," it continued. "They were so eager to explore, so excited to map new passages. They made such wonderful hollow vessels once we emptied them out. I fired twice, center mass, just like my training. The bullets passed right through Tom's body without slowing down, sparking off the cave wall behind him. He laughed, a sound like grinding stone. "Bullets can't hurt the empty places, Jerry. But don't worry, soon you'll be empty too, and it won't hurt anymore. Nothing hurts when you're hollow." My carbide flame bounced wildly as I sprinted across the chamber toward what looked like another passage. Behind me, Tom's laughter echoed off the walls, joined by dozens of other voices laughing the same grinding laugh. The new passage was narrow, forcing me to crawl through sections barely wider than my shoulders. The handprints here were fresh and damp, like someone had just pressed them into the stone seconds before I arrived. Some still glistened with moisture that definitely wasn't water. I crawled for what felt like miles through twisting, branching passages that hadn't existed on any survey maps. My altimeter showed impossible depths. According to the readings, I was now more than a mile underground, deeper than any known cave system in Virginia. The passage finally opened into another chamber, and what I saw there made me understand why the mountain had such a dark reputation. Dozens of human figures sat in a perfect circle around the chamber walls. They looked like people at first glance, men and women of different ages, all sitting upright with their hands folded in their laps. But when my lamp flame played across their faces, I could see they were completely dried out, mummified, with empty eye sockets that seemed to follow my movements. In the center of the circle sat 3 newer bodies that I recognized: Sarah, Mike, and David, the missing students. They looked fresh, almost alive, except for their eyes. Their eye sockets were as empty and dark as all the others, and they were all staring right at me. That's when I realized the truth about Devil's Backbone. The Cherokee legends weren't just stories. The warnings about empty people weren't just mountain superstition. Something lived in these deep caves, something that had been here long before the first humans arrived, and it was very, very hungry. The mummified figures began to move. They rose from their positions with movements like broken marionettes, joints bending at wrong angles, heads tilting too far to one side. The newer bodies, the students, moved more naturally, but their empty eye sockets never stopped tracking my position. "Welcome, Ranger," Sarah's body said in a voice like autumn wind through dry leaves. "We've been waiting for you to join our circle." The thing that looked like Mike stood up and took a step forward. "We've been so lonely since the last visitors. It's been nearly 20 years since someone strong enough survived the journey to our sacred chamber." I backed toward the wall, carbide lamp held high, trying to keep all the moving bodies in sight. "What are you? What did you do to these people?" "We are the Hollow Men," the Sarah thing replied. "We were soldiers once during your Civil War. Confederate deserters who fled into these caves to escape the fighting. We found something old here, something that offered us eternal life in exchange for our souls." The David thing smiled with too many teeth. "We became empty vessels, and in return, we never age, never die, never feel pain or fear or sadness. But the emptiness needs to be fed. We need fresh souls to sustain us." More figures were moving now, the older mummified bodies creaking like old leather as they stepped away from the walls. I counted at least 40 of them, maybe 50, all moving in my direction with that same puppet-like gait. "You will join us willingly," Mike's voice continued, "or we will take what we need by force. Either way, your essence will feed our emptiness for years to come." I raised my pistol again, knowing it was useless but needing to do something. "Stay back! I'm warning you!" The closest figure, an ancient dried-out man in the rotting remains of a Confederate uniform, reached out toward me. His fingers were impossibly long, with black nails that looked more like claws. When his hand touched my arm, cold shot through my body like I'd been dunked in ice water. Instantly, I felt something draining out of me. Not blood or breath, but something deeper. Memories started getting fuzzy around the edges. My brother Tommy's face became harder to remember. The warmth I felt when I thought about my late wife started to fade. I jerked away and stumbled backward, but there were more of them behind me now. Cold hands grabbed at my arms, my legs, my neck. Each touch drained a little more life, a little more of what made me human. That's when I remembered my father's stories about working in the coal mines. How they'd use carbide lamps, not just for light, but for protection against the things that lived in the deepest tunnels. How open flame was the only thing that could drive back the creatures that fed on human souls. I yanked the carbide lamp off my helmet and held it like a weapon. The flame burned brighter than it should have, casting dancing shadows on the chamber walls. The Hollow Men pulled back, hissing like angry cats. "Fire," I whispered, then louder, "You're afraid of fire." The Confederate soldier who'd touched me smiled with a mouth full of broken teeth. "Clever boy, but one small flame won't save you from all of us." He was right. There were too many of them, and my lamp wouldn't burn forever. The carbide mixture would last maybe 2 more hours if I was lucky. But it was something, and right now, something was better than nothing. I swung the lamp in a wide arc, keeping the creatures at bay while I tried to think of a way out. The chamber had multiple passages leading away from it, but I had no idea which ones led back toward the surface and which led deeper into the mountain. Then I heard a sound that gave me hope: running water and air. Flow often meant connections to the surface. I followed the sound to a narrow passage on the far side of the chamber, fighting my way through grasping hands and snapping teeth, using the lamp flame to clear a path. The hollow puppet master movements becoming more coordinated. The newer ones, the students, were quickest, their bodies still fresh enough for smooth motion. Blazing into the passage, just as Sarah's reanimated corpse lunged for my legs. I kicked backward and felt my boot connect with something that crunched like dry twigs. Her scream echoed behind me, a sound like metal scraping on stone. The passage was tight, barely wide enough for my shoulders, but I could hear running water getting louder ahead. I crawled frantically through the limestone tunnel, my lamp flame creating wild shadows that danced across the walls. Behind me, the Hollow Men were trying to follow, but the narrow passage slowed them down. I could hear them scraping against the rocks, their dried-out bodies breaking apart as they forced themselves through spaces too small for their ancient frames. The passage opened into a natural chimney, a vertical shaft that stretched up into darkness. An underground waterfall cascaded down one side, disappearing into cracks at the bottom. But most importantly, I could feel fresh air flowing down from somewhere high above. I clipped my rope to a rock formation and started climbing. using the techniques my father had taught me in the coal mines. Hand over hand, feet braced against the opposite wall, working my way up toward whatever lay at the top of the shaft. Below me, the hollow men emerged from the passage and began climbing too, their inhuman strength allowing them to scale the vertical walls like spiders. But they were still afraid of the flame, and I kept the lamp burning bright as I climbed. My muscles screamed with exhaustion by the time I reached the top of the shaft, maybe 100 feet up. I hauled myself over the edge and found myself in another cave chamber, this one with multiple cracks in the ceiling that let in thin beams of actual sunlight. I was almost to the surface, but as I stumbled toward the largest crack, hoping to squeeze through to the outside world, I heard Tom Whitehawk's voice behind me. "Going somewhere, Jerry?" I turned to see the thing wearing my partner's face emerging from the shaft, moving with that same wrong, floating motion. Behind it came the others, dozens of empty-eyed figures climbing out of the darkness like some horrible parade. "You can't escape us," Tom said. "We know every passage, every chamber, every way in and out of these mountains. You belong to us now." I looked at the crack in the ceiling. It was maybe 3 feet wide and 20 feet up, too high to reach, too narrow to climb safely. But it was the only way out, the only chance I had to see the sun again. A decision that would haunt me for the rest of my life. I unscrewed the carbide tank from my helmet lamp and threw it as hard as I could at the wall of the chamber. The tank exploded in a ball of flame that lit up the entire cave like daylight. The hollow men screamed in unison, their voices combining into a wail that seemed to shake the mountain itself. The explosion triggered something in the cave structure. Rocks began falling from the ceiling, and I heard the deep groaning sound that every cave rescue worker learns to fear, the sound of an imminent collapse. I dove for the crack in the ceiling as the chamber came apart around me, rocks the size of cars crashing down where I'd been standing seconds before. The shaft behind me filled with dust and debris, cutting off the hollow men's pursuit, but also cutting off my own escape route. I was trapped in a small pocket of space between fallen rocks and solid limestone, with just enough air to breathe and just enough light filtering down from above to see that I might, possibly, be able to squeeze through the crack to freedom. It took me 4 hours to dig my way out, moving rocks one at a time, widening the crack inch by inch until I could finally push through to the surface. When I emerged into the late afternoon sunlight, I felt like I'd been reborn. But my relief was short-lived. As I stumbled away from the crack, I heard a voice calling my name from somewhere in the woods. "Jerry! Jerry, where are you?" It was Tom Whitehawk's voice, but this time it sounded right, human, alive. I found him tied to a tree about 50 yards from the cave opening, unconscious but breathing. When I untied him and shook him awake, he looked up at me with eyes that reflected no light at all, normal, human eyes. "What happened?" he asked groggily. "Last thing I remember, I was hiking to the cave entrance. Then everything went black." I looked at Tom's face carefully. Same features, same beard, same brown eyes I'd known for 8 years. But this time, something was there. The spark of life, the warmth of a human soul. "How long was I out?" he asked as I helped him to his feet. I looked at my watch and felt my blood turn cold. According to the time, Tom had been missing for only 3 hours, but he looked like he'd aged 20 years. His hair had gone completely grey, deep lines creased his face, and his hands shook like an old man's. "Tom," I said quietly, "what's the last thing you remember before waking up here?" He thought for a moment, then shuddered. Dark places, cold like I've never felt, and voices, empty voices calling my name. He looked at me with haunted eyes. "Jerry, what happened to us down there?" I didn't have an answer that would make either of us feel better. The official report listed the cave system as geologically unstable due to recent seismic activity. The Army Corps of Engineers sealed every known entrance with concrete and steel, declaring the entire area off-limits to recreational cavers. The 3 missing students were listed as lost due to cave collapse, and their bodies were never recovered. Tom Whitehawk retired on medical disability 3 weeks later. Whatever had happened to him during those missing hours had aged him beyond his years. He moved to Florida to live with his sister, claiming the mountain cold hurt his bones too much to stay. He never talked about what he remembered from the cave, and I never asked. As for me, I requested immediate transfer to fire tower duty. After 17 years of cave rescues, I found I couldn't handle enclosed spaces anymore. Even walking into a building with no windows made me break out in cold sweats. The official term was severe claustrophobia, brought on by traumatic stress. The real reason was simpler. I'd seen what lived in the deep, dark places, and I never wanted to meet them again. Butterflies. But the story doesn't end with sealed caves and early retirements. 6 months after Devil's Backbone was closed, I started getting reports of similar handprints showing up in other cave systems throughout the Appalachians. Always the same pattern. 4 elongated fingers, no thumb, pressed deep into stone that should have been rock hard. Always accompanied by stories of missing cavers and voices whispering in empty passages. Michelle men weren't confined to one cave system. They were spread throughout the old mountains, anywhere humans had gone deep enough and desperate enough to make bargains with things that should have stayed buried. With the Park Service documenting these incidents, creating an unofficial database of dangerous cave systems that I passed along to my replacement. Not the official reasons for their danger, gas pockets, unstable geology, flash flood risk, but the real reasons. The ones that would get me laughed out of any serious scientific discussion. Some places in these mountains aren't meant for human exploration. Some caves lead to more than just underground rivers and limestone formations. And sometimes, when people go missing in the deep dark, it's not because they fell down a shaft or got lost in unmapped passages. Sometimes, they just became empty. I retired in 1978 and moved to a small cabin outside Charlottesville, far from any cave systems. But even now, 43 years later, I still wake up some nights hearing whispers in the walls, still find myself checking my carbide lamp before bed, making sure the flame burns bright enough to keep the darkness at bay. If you're reading this, if you're the kind of person who likes to explore wild places and push boundaries, let me give you one piece of advice. Respect the mountains. Respect the deep places. And if you ever find yourself in a cave system where the handprints on the walls don't look quite human, where the whispers seem to be calling your name, where your equipment stops working and the silence gets so thick you can taste it, prescribe. Turn around. Walk away. Don't look back. Because some emptiness, once you fall into it, you can never climb back out. And Devil's Backbone is still out there, somewhere beneath those sealed concrete plugs, waiting for someone curious enough or foolish enough to find another way in. The hollow men have all the time in the world. They're very patient. And they're always hungry. My name is Rebecca Ironwood, and I've been a park ranger in the Great Smoky Mountains for 13 years. People ask me why I chose this job, especially being the first woman ranger in the Copper Mountain district. The truth is, I love these mountains. I have a PhD in zoology, and there's nothing I enjoy more than tracking wildlife through these ancient peaks. At least, that's what I used to think. In March of 1974, I thought I'd seen everything these mountains could throw at me. I'd tracked and moved 23 problem bears. I'd studied mountain lions for my research. I knew every trail, every ridge, every hidden spring in my district. The other rangers called me Doc because of my degree, but I preferred to think of myself as someone who understood the science behind the wilderness. The Cherokee have stories about these mountains, old stories about creatures that protect sacred places. The local folks talk about the wampus cat, a giant wildcat that walks on 2 legs and screams like a woman in pain. I'd heard these tales my whole career, and I always had the same response: misidentified cougars and old folklore mixing together. Copper Mountain rises 6,200 feet above the valley floor. It's covered in thick rhododendron bushes that grow so close together they form tunnels. In March, when the snow melts and the fog rolls through the valleys, it's one of the most beautiful places on Earth. It's also 8 miles from the visitor center, and radio coverage gets spotty once you climb above 5,000 feet. I should have paid more attention to that last part. The first call came in on a Tuesday morning. 2 hikers had reported being attacked by what they described as a 6-foot wildcat that walked on its back legs. The male hiker, Tom Bradley, had claw marks across his shoulder. His girlfriend, Sarah Chen, was shaking so hard she could barely speak. "It wasn't a bear," Tom kept saying as the EMTs loaded him into the ambulance. "Bears don't move like that. This thing, it jumped over a creek that was 15 feet wide, just sailed right over it." I took their statement and photographed Tom's wounds. The claw marks were deep, deeper than any mountain lion should be able to make. They were spaced wide too, like they came from something with much bigger paws than any cat I'd ever studied. But animals can surprise you. Maybe this was an injured cougar that had developed an unusual way of walking. Maybe the hiker's fear had made them see things that weren't really there. I'd investigate, collect some evidence, and probably end up relocating another problem predator. Blinked I packed my gear that afternoon: plaster for making casts of tracks, my 35mm camera, emergency radio, and my tranquilizer gun. Bill Hawkins, our maintenance crew chief, offered to help. Bill had grown up in these mountains and knew them almost as well as I did. "You be careful up there, Doc," he said as I loaded my truck. "Something's got the wildlife spooked. Haven't seen a single deer track on the lower trails for 3 days." "Animals migrate," I told him. "Spring patterns change all the time." But as I drove up the winding mountain road toward Copper Mountain, I noticed Bill was right. No deer, no squirrels. Even the birds seemed quieter than usual. The forest felt empty. Patriotism, I parked at the trailhead where the attack happened and started looking for sign. It didn't take long to find the tracks. They were unlike anything I'd ever seen. The basic shape was feline, round paws with what looked like retractable claw marks. But they were huge, almost as big as my hand. And there was something else. Something that made my stomach tighten as I knelt down to examine them closer. Mixed in with the normal cat tracks were prints that looked almost human. Not human exactly, but like a cat's paw with fingers. The palm was elongated, and there were 5 separate toe marks instead of the usual 4. I made plaster casts of the best prints and photographed everything. Then I followed the trail deeper into the rhododendron thickets. The tracks led up the mountain, toward an area the Cherokee had always said was sacred, a place where early settlers had reported strange disappearances back in the 1800s. As the sun started to set, I made camp about a mile up the trail. I set up my camera traps around the area where the tracks were freshest, hoping to get photos of whatever was making them. That night, I heard the screaming for the first time. It started around midnight, a sound like a woman being murdered, but with an animal quality underneath it. The sound echoed off the mountain walls, making it impossible to tell where it was coming from. It went on for almost 10 minutes, then stopped as suddenly as it had started. I lay in my sleeping bag, heart pounding, trying to convince myself it was just a normal mountain lion call, distorted by the terrain. But I knew I was lying to myself. I woke up before dawn to find my camera traps destroyed. Not just broken, destroyed. The metal casings were crushed like someone had squeezed them in a giant fist. The film was pulled out and scattered across the ground in long black ribbons. Whatever had done this had incredible strength, and it had been smart enough to find every single camera. I radioed back to headquarters, but the signal was too weak to get through clearly. Static filled most of my transmission. I was on my own until I hiked back down to where the radio worked better. I spent the morning following the tracks further up the mountain. They led to a grove of old oak trees that must have been growing there for hundreds of years. The Cherokee consider groves like this sacred, places where the spirit world touches our world. Then where I found the backpack. It was hanging from a branch 25 feet up in one of the oaks, just hanging there like someone had tossed it up with no effort at all. The tree trunk below it was scarred with claw marks that went deep into the wood, deeper than any normal animal could scratch. Abandonment climbing gear to reach the pack. It belonged to Mike Stevens, a solo hiker who'd been reported missing 3 days earlier. Inside, I found his wallet, his camera, and a journal. The last entry was dated 2 days ago. Something's following me. I can feel it watching from the bushes. The other animals are gone, even the insects. It's too quiet. Going to try to reach the ranger station tomorrow. He never made it. Colonization, I found Mike's body that afternoon, about a quarter mile from where his pack had been hanging. I've seen a lot of animal attacks in my career, but nothing like this. Mike had been killed by massive claws, but his body hadn't been eaten. It was arranged, placed carefully against a large boulder like he was sleeping. Whatever killed him wanted him to be found. I radioed for backup and a body recovery team, but I was told it would be morning before anyone could reach me. The spring thaw had made the roads muddy, and they couldn't risk getting a vehicle stuck in the dark. Confiscated, I made camp near Mike's body, following proper procedure. In cases like this, you don't leave the scene unguarded. But as darkness fell, I started to question that decision. The screaming started again around 9 o'clock. This time it was closer, and it wasn't just screaming. There were other sounds mixed in, sounds that almost sounded like words, but in a language I didn't understand. I built up my campfire and kept my tranquilizer gun ready. The fire seemed to keep whatever was out there at a distance, but I could see eyes reflecting the firelight from the darkness beyond the trees. Yellow eyes, set much higher off the ground than any mountain lions should be. Around midnight, I heard branches breaking in the rhododendron thicket behind me. Something big was moving through the dense bushes, circling my camp. The footsteps were wrong. Sometimes they sounded like a four-legged animal, sometimes like something walking on 2 legs. I called out, hoping it might be another hiker. "Hello, is someone there?" Footsteps stopped. Then something answered me. It wasn't human speech, but it wasn't animal either. It sounded like a voice trying to form words, but not quite managing it, like someone who'd forgotten how to talk. "Go away." The voice was deep and raspy, with a growling undertone that made my skin crawl. It came from about 10 feet outside the circle of my firelight. "Who are you?" I called back, trying to keep my voice steady. "This place is sacred." I could see a shape moving in the darkness beyond my fire. Something large and low to the ground, but wrong somehow. Too big to be a mountain lion, moving in a way that didn't match any animal I knew. I reached for my radio but remembered it wouldn't work up here. I was completely alone with something that could talk but wasn't human. The shape moved closer, just to the edge of where my firelight ended. I got a glimpse of yellow eyes and dark fur before it stepped back into the shadows. "Leave. Now. Or die. Like others." Sentenced. Then it was gone. The footsteps faded into the distance, and I was left alone with the crackling fire and my racing heart. I didn't sleep that night. I just fed the fire and watched the darkness until dawn came and the rescue team arrived. The official report listed Mike Stevens' death as a mountain lion attack. The Park Service didn't want to start a panic about some unknown predator, so they temporarily closed the Copper Mountain trails and sent me back up with a team to locate and relocate the problem animal. Bill Hawkins volunteered to come with me, along with 2 other rangers and a wildlife specialist from the state. We set up base camp at the grove where I'd found the backpack, planning to track the animal systematically. "Doc, you look like you haven't slept in a week," Bill said as we made camp. You sure you're okay to be up here?" I hadn't told anyone about the voice. Who would believe me? Instead, I focused on the physical evidence, the tracks, the claw marks, the impossible strength it would take to hang a backpack 25 feet up a tree. "Just want to catch this thing before someone else gets hurt," I told him. We set up a grid search pattern and started tracking. The signs were everywhere once you knew what to look for. Claw marks on trees, tracks in the muddy areas, and that same wrongness in the forest. No birds, no small animals, like every living thing was hiding. On our second day, we found more evidence. A deer carcass hanging from another tree, this one 30 feet up. The deer hadn't been killed for food. It was a message. A warning that we were in something's territory. That's when state wildlife specialist Dr. Martinez started talking about tranquilizer protocols. "Based on the size of these tracks, we're looking at an animal that weighs at least 300 pounds, he said. "I'll need to adjust the drug dosage accordingly." "What if it's not a normal animal?" I asked. Everyone looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "What do you mean, Doc?" Bill asked. I couldn't tell them about the voice, but I could share my concerns about the behavior. The Cherokee have stories about this area, stories about guardians that protect sacred places. What if we're dealing with something that's not quite normal? Dr. Martinez laughed. "Rebecca, you're a scientist. You know better than to buy into local folklore." But Bill didn't laugh. He'd grown up hearing the same stories. "My grandmother used to tell me about the Wampus cat," he said quietly. "She said it was a Cherokee medicine man who was cursed to become a guardian spirit. Half man, half cat, protecting the old places from people who would harm them." "That's just stories," Dr. Martinez said. But I noticed he checked his tranquilizer gun again. We found fresh tracks that afternoon, leading toward the peak of Copper Mountain. The trail was clear and easy to follow, too easy, like whatever we were tracking wanted us to follow it. The tracks led to a narrow ravine about 30 feet across. On the other side, we could see more tracks leading up toward the summit. Dr. Martinez was studying his topographic map, looking for a way around. "There's a trail that loops around to the north," he said. "It'll add about 2 hours to our hike, but..." That's when we saw it jump. It came from somewhere high up on the cliff face on the far side of the ravine. One moment the air was empty, the next moment something dark and massive was sailing across the 30-foot gap, like it was nothing. It landed on our side with a soft thud, then disappeared into the rhododendron bushes before any of us could get a clear look. "When you see that," whispered one of the other rangers. We all saw it. No normal animal could make a leap like that. The physics just didn't work. Martinez was shaking as he checked his equipment. Maybe we should call for backup. But Bill was already moving toward where the thing had landed. "Look at this," he called. Records were there in the soft mud, the same impossible combination of feline paws and human-like digits. But these were fresh, still filling with water. "It's playing with us," I realized. It could have attacked us when we were looking at the map, but instead it just wanted to show us what it could do. That night, we made camp in a defensible position, backs to a rock wall, fire in front, clear sight lines in all directions. We took turns on watch, 2 people awake at all times, while Bill and I had the midnight shift. We sat by the fire, listening to the night sounds of the forest. Except there weren't any. Even the wind seemed muffled. "Capitalists," Bill said quietly. "I need to tell you something. My grandmother didn't just tell stories about the Wampus cat. She claimed she saw it once, when she was young." "What did she say it looked like?" "Like a mountain lion, but bigger, much bigger. And it could stand up on 2 legs when it wanted to. She said its eyes held intelligence. Not animal intelligence, but human intelligence trapped in an animal body. Paralyzed, a branch snapped somewhere in the darkness beyond our fire. She also said it could speak," Bill continued. "Not clearly, but enough to understand. It would warn people away from places they shouldn't go." Another branch snapped, closer this time. I was about to tell Bill about the voice I'd heard when something stepped into our firelight. It was exactly what Bill's grandmother had described. A mountain lion, but wrong in every way. Too big, maybe 6 feet long, not counting its tail. Its shoulders were broader than any cat's should be. more like a man's, and when it reared up on its hind legs to look at us, it stood nearly 7 feet tall. Its eyes were yellow and intelligent and completely, terrifyingly human. Bill reached for his tranquilizer gun, but the creature spoke before he could raise it. No more warnings. His voice was clearer than it had been 3 nights ago, like it was remembering how to use human speech. You bring others. You bring machinists. You desecrate the holy places. Dr. Martinez and the other rangers were awake now, reaching for their weapons, but I held up my hand to stop them. We're just trying to protect people, I said to the creature. People have been hurt. Its lips pulled back, revealing fangs longer than my fingers. People hurt the mountain first. I protect. I guard. Always guard. Unprotected. You're the Cherokee medicine man, I said, the pieces falling into place. The one from the stories. It nodded slowly. Cursed to guard. Cursed to protect. Until the mountain needs me no more. That's when Bill made his mistake. He raised his tranquilizer gun. The creature moved faster than anything that size should be able to move. One moment it was 10 feet away. The next it was on top of Bill, claws extended. Freezes, I heard Bill scream. I saw blood. I saw claws as long as kitchen knives raking across his chest. Then Dr. Martinez shot it, with enough tranquilizer to drop a grizzly bear, and it staggered back into the darkness. But it didn't fall down. Palestinians was alive, but barely. The claw marks across his chest went deep, and he'd lost a lot of blood. We radioed for an emergency medical helicopter and started first aid, but we all knew it would be touch and go. Why didn't the tranquilizer work? Dr. Martinez kept asking. I gave it enough to drop anything. I was beginning to understand that we weren't dealing with anything normal. The Cherokee stories weren't folklore, they were warnings. This creature wasn't just an animal, it was something much more dangerous. While the others worked on Bill, I followed the blood trail. The creature was hurt but not down, and I needed to understand what we were really facing. The trail led up toward the summit of Copper Mountain, toward the sacred grove the Cherokee had told us never to enter. With each step, I felt like I was walking into a place humans weren't meant to go. Behind the creature in ancient Cherokee symbols were carved into the rocks around the edges, symbols I recognized from my research as protective wards. The creature was lying beside a small spring, licking its wounds. When it saw me, it raised its head but didn't attack. Why? I asked. Why are you doing this? It struggled to its feet, still groggy from the drugs. The Whittered men came, it said, its voice clearer now. They cut the trees, they poisoned the waters, they buried the sacred grounds under their roads. That was 100 years ago, I said. The park protects these places now. Blackjack? Park? The creature's laugh was a horrifying sound, half human and half growl. Your park brings thousands. They walk where they shouldn't walk. They take what is not theirs. I looked around the clearing and saw what it meant. This wasn't just any grove. It was a burial ground, a place where Cherokee leaders had been laid to rest for centuries, and we'd been trampling through it like it was just another hiking trail. I was the guardian, the creature continued. When the curse was placed, I accepted. I gave up my human from to protect this place. How long? I asked. Since 1838, since the soldiers drove my people away. 1838, the Trail of Tears. This creature had been guarding this mountain for over 130 years. You killed those hikers, I said. Abolished, I warned them. They did not listen. They camped in the burial ground. They left garbage in the sacred spring. I understood now why Mike Stevens had been arranged so carefully. It wasn't cruelty, it was respect. Even in death, the Guardian had honored him as a person while protecting what it was sworn to guard. What do you want? I asked. the creature's yellow eyes fixed on mine. I want the desecrations to stop. I want the businessmen to stay away. I want the sacred places to remain sacred. Behind me, I heard helicopters approaching, the medical evacuation for Bill, and probably backup rangers too. Soon, this mountain would be swarming with people, all of them trying to hunt down and kill this creature. "If I help you," I said, "will you stop killing people? If they stay away from the sacred places, they will live." I made a decision that would change my life forever. Instead of leading the rangers to the creature, I would help it protect what it was sworn to guard. The helicopters were getting closer. I had maybe 5 minutes before they arrived. "There's a survey team planning to put a new trail through this area," I told the creature. "They want to open up the summit to more hikers." Metallic, its eyes flashed with fury. "Never." "I can stop them," I said, "but I need you to trust me. No more killing unless they actually threaten the sacred places. Can you do that?" The creature studied me for a long moment. Then it nodded slowly. "But if they come here with their machinists, if they dig up the bonus of my ancestors—" "They won't," I promised. "I'll make sure they won't." The helicopters were overhead now, looking for a place to land. I had to get back to camp before they sent people looking for me. "There's one more thing," the creature said as I turned to leave. "You have seen me. You have spoken with me. The curse touches you now." "What does that mean?" "It means you will guard this place too. Not as I guard it, but as your kind can guard it. With laws, with words, with truth." Tentative, I felt something change inside me as it spoke. A sense of responsibility I'd never felt before. This mountain, these sacred places, they were mine to protect now too. Bill survived his injuries, but the nerve damage meant he could never do field work again. They transferred him to a desk job at park headquarters, and he never talked about what happened on Copper Mountain. Dr. Martinez filed a report about an unusually large and aggressive mountain lion that had demonstrated abnormal intelligence and territorial behavior. He recommended that the area be permanently closed to hiking. Kennedy, I filed a different report. Affordability, the Cherokee burial ground. I researched the historical significance of the area and its protection under federal laws governing Native American sacred sites. I wrote up a case for declaring the entire summit of Copper Mountain off-limits to development. When the survey team came to plan the new trail, they found their equipment vandalized every morning. Their surveying stakes were pulled up and thrown into the ravine. Their maps were shredded. After 3 weeks of this, they gave up and recommended against the trail expansion. The official reason given for closing the Copper Mountain summit was unstable wildlife habitat and significant archaeological resources. No one questioned it. I became an advocate for protecting Native American sacred sites throughout the park system. I worked with Cherokee tribal leaders to identify other locations that needed special protection. I learned that there were stories like the one I'd experienced all through these mountains. Guardians who still watched over the old places. Sometimes, on quiet nights in the ranger station, I get reports from other districts. Rangers who've seen things that don't quite fit in their official reports. Creatures that are too intelligent to be normal animals. Voices speaking from the darkness in languages that sound almost human, but not quite. I tell them to be respectful. I tell them to listen to the local stories. And I tell them that sometimes the best way to protect people is to protect the places that were sacred long before we got here. The Wampus cat still guards Copper Mountain. Hikers sometimes report seeing yellow eyes watching them from the tree line, but only when they venture too close to areas they shouldn't be. As long as people respect the boundaries, they're safe. Imprisoned. I've seen it 3 more times over the years. Always from a distance. Always when I'm checking to make sure the protective measures are still in place. It nods to me when it sees me, and I nod back. We're both guardians now. We're both protecting the same thing. The pointed, fections, The Cherokee were right about one thing. Some places are too sacred to be treated like tourist destinations. Some places need to be guarded, whether by ancient curses or modern laws. And sometimes, if you're very unlucky or very foolish, you might hear the screaming echoing off the mountain walls at night. The sound of something that was once human, calling out a warning that goes back more than a century. Lunches. Listen to it. Extra around. Buffering. Go back the way you came, because some mountains hold secrets that are meant to stay hidden, and some guardians will do whatever it takes to keep them safe. My name is Rebecca Ironwood, and I've spent 27 years protecting these mountains, but I'm not the only one watching over them, and you should be afraid of. My name is Caleb Mountainheart, and I've been a forest ranger in these West Virginia mountains for 20 years. My family's been here for 6 generations, building bridges and maintaining trails through some of the roughest country you'll ever see. I know every creek, every ridge, and every old bridge in the Monongahela National Forest like they're my own children. Officers, telling you this story because what happened to me on Devil's Fork Bridge changed everything I thought I knew about my job. Before that November day in 1981, I figured bridge collapse stories were just poor maintenance and harsh weather. Metal gets old, wood rots, and mountain storms can tear apart anything humans build. Simple as that. The Cheat Mountain area where I work sits 12 miles from the nearest town. It's the kind of place where cell phones don't work, and your truck radio only picks up static. Devil's Fork Bridge spans a 200-foot gorge with a fast stream rushing over rocks far below. Ancient hemlocks grow so thick on both sides that even at noon, the bridge sits in shadow. The bridge itself was built back in the 1920s, a steel truss design that should have lasted forever with proper care. It's the only way to reach the Eastern Trail system, so keeping it safe matters. Hikers, hunters, and research teams all depend on that bridge. If it fails, people die. That morning started like any other. Ice had formed overnight from an early winter freeze, and I needed to check the bridge deck for damage. Ice and steel don't play nice together. The metal contracts and expands, creating stress fractures that can turn deadly without warning. I loaded my truck with the usual inspection gear, stress gauges, concrete core sample tools, my grandfather's old carpenter level that never lied. The drive up took 40 minutes on winding mountain roads that barely deserved the name. But as soon as I parked near the bridge approach, something felt wrong. The forest was too quiet. No birds, no squirrels rustling through leaves, no insects buzzing. Even the stream below seemed muffled, like someone had wrapped the whole area in cotton. I've worked in these mountains long enough to trust my gut when the wilderness gets strange. Animals sense things humans miss. When they all go quiet at once, it usually means bad weather coming or a predator nearby. I grabbed my clipboard and walked onto the bridge deck. The metal felt solid under my boots, no unusual vibration or sway. But the handrails were ice cold, even though the morning sun should have warmed them by now. When I touched the steel beam with my bare hand, it was like grabbing a frozen pipe. Well, that's when I saw the first bone. It was small, maybe from a rabbit or squirrel, met the main support beam. Nothing unusual about that. Hawks and owls drop bones all the time. But when I tried to pull it free, the bone wouldn't budge. It wasn't just stuck. It looked like it had grown right out of the metal. Pulled out my flashlight and checked the other beams. More bones, all different sizes, all somehow fused into the bridge structure. Some looked fresh, others old and yellowed. A few were clearly too big to come from small forest animals. My hands started shaking, and not from the cold. In 20 years of bridge maintenance, I'd never seen anything like this. Bridges don't grow bones. Metal doesn't fuse with animal remains. There had to be a logical explanation. Coyotes had been using the bridge to feed, dropping scraps that somehow got caught in the structural joints. Mountain winters can preserve bones for years. The fusing effect might just be ice and corrosion making things stick together. That's what I told myself anyway. I spent 2 hours documenting everything, taking photos and measurements. The bones appeared randomly throughout the bridge structure. No pattern I could figure out. Some were definitely animal, bird wings, deer legs, small mammal skulls, but others looked disturbingly human-like. When I finally packed up my gear, the sun had climbed high enough to reach the bridge deck, but the metal still felt freezing cold, and that absolute silence continued. Even my truck engine sounded wrong, like the noise was being swallowed up before it could echo off the gorge walls. Divisional back to the ranger station, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me leave. Every time I checked my rearview mirror, the bridge looked normal, just old steel and shadows. But that wrongness stayed with me all day, like a splinter working its way deeper under my skin. 3 days later, I came back with County Engineer Patricia Millstone. Pat had worked with me on dozens of bridge inspections over the years. She was smart, thorough, and wouldn't put up with any nonsense about strange feelings or animal bones. "Probably just predator feeding patterns," she said as we unloaded testing equipment from her truck. "Hawks and owls use bridges as perches. Bones fall into crevices and get stuck." While I wanted to believe her, but the silence hit us again as soon as we stepped onto the bridge approach. Pat noticed it too, though she didn't say anything. "Let's start with load testing," she said, setting up her electronic stress gauge. "Check the bearing points and measure fatigue fractures." I attached sensors to the main support beams, while Pat calibrated her equipment. The metal felt even colder than before, cold enough that our breath fogged when we touched the steel. My tools kept slipping from my numb fingers. "The temperature's affecting the readings," Pat muttered, frowning at her gauge. "Metal shouldn't be this cold with direct sunlight." That's when her equipment started acting up. The stress gauge kept resetting itself, showing impossible readings. My compass spun randomly. The metal detector I'd brought went crazy, beeping and clicking like it had found buried treasure in every direction. "Magnetic interference," Pat said, but her voice sounded uncertain. "Maybe underground mineral deposits affecting our instruments." I found the human bone. It was wedged deep into a joint where 2 main support beams connected. Not a small fragment this time, but most of a human thigh bone. A femur, yellowed with age but perfectly preserved. And just like the animal bones, it looked like it had been there when the bridge was built. "That's impossible," Pat said when I showed her. She examined the bone carefully, running her hands along where it connected to the steel. This joint was welded solid in the 1920s. Nothing could have been added later, before the human leg bone fused into the bridge structure, like it had been mixed right into the construction process. Pat tried to photograph the bone, but her camera wouldn't work properly. Every picture came out blurry or completely black, even in bright daylight. My backup camera did the same thing. "Equipment failure," she said, but I could hear the worry in her voice. "We'll document everything by hand and come back with different gear." We spent another hour testing the bridge, but our instruments kept malfunctioning. Temperature sensors showed readings 30 degrees below actual air temperature. Metal detectors went off constantly. Even our simple tools felt wrong. Screwdrivers became magnetized. Hammers felt too heavy or too light. Around noon, the bridge started making noise. It began as tiny creaking sounds, like old wood settling. But the bridge was steel and concrete, and there was no wind. The sounds got louder, groaning, squealing, metal rubbing against metal. The whole structure started swaying slightly, even though we were standing perfectly still. "Wind shear from the gorge," Pat said, but she was gripping the handrail tight enough to turn her knuckles white. Back and forth, side to side, like something invisible was shaking the bridge from underneath. Our equipment rattled and clanged. My clipboard fell through a gap in the deck that hadn't been there minutes before. Pat screamed. I turned just in time to see her foot disappear through what looked like solid bridge decking. 1 second she was standing on steel grating, the next her leg was sinking into the metal like it was quicksand. I grabbed her arms and pulled hard. Her leg came free, but she was hurt. Her ankle twisted at a bad angle, blood soaking through torn pants where the metal had scraped her skin. "The bridge deck was solid," she gasped, staring at the spot where her foot had gone through. I checked it myself. Steel grating doesn't just turn into holes. But when we looked, the deck was perfect again. Solid steel, no gaps, no damage, like nothing had happened at all. I helped Pat back to the trucks, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might burst. Her ankle was definitely broken, maybe worse. As we drove away, I kept checking my mirrors. The bridge looked normal in the distance, just old steel spanning a mountain gorge. But I knew we'd crossed a line into something that couldn't be explained by equipment failure or electromagnetic interference. Something was wrong with that bridge, wrong in ways that made my 20 years of mountain experience feel worthless. Pat went to the hospital, and I went home to think about human bones fused into steel beams and bridge decks that turned solid and liquid without warning. That night, I started researching the construction history of Devil's Fork Bridge. What I found made everything much worse. The records were buried in county archives dating back to 1921. Construction of Devil's Fork Bridge had been rushed, completed in just 4 months during a harsh winter. The original contractor was a company called Mountainside Construction, owned by a man named Ernest Blackwood. Freezes had died during construction. Falls, they said. Accidents caused by dangerous winter conditions and pressure to finish quickly. But what really caught my attention was the location. The bridge was built directly over a mass grave from the 1918 flu epidemic. Over 200 people had been buried there in a hurry when the local cemetery ran out of space. Families were dying faster than proper graves could be dug. The construction records mentioned local materials and cost-saving aggregate. In construction terms, aggregate meant sand, gravel, and crushed stone mixed into concrete. But what if desperate contractors had used other things as filler? Things that were already buried in the ground right where they were building. I drove back to the bridge the next morning, bringing a concrete core sample drill and my grandfather's old geology hammer. If human remains had been mixed into the bridge construction, I'd find evidence. The silence hit me before I even got out of my truck. Deeper than before, like the whole forest was holding its breath. No wind, no birds, no sound except my boots on gravel. I set up the core drill on one of the main foundation pillars and started boring into the concrete. The bit went in smooth for the first few inches, then hit something hard. When I pulled up the sample, chunks of bone came with it. Human teeth, fragments of skull, pieces of rib cage. They weren't just mixed into the concrete, they were the concrete. Whoever built this bridge had ground up human remains and used them as construction material. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold the drill. I took more samples from different spots. Every single core came up full of bone fragments. The entire foundation of Devil's Fork Bridge was built on a literal pile of human remains. That's when the manifestations started. Chronological, it was just temperature changes. Cold spots that moved around the bridge like invisible people walking past. Then the metal started groaning and flexing without any load or wind pressure. I tried to leave, but my truck wouldn't start. The engine turned over fine, but something was wrong with the electrical system. Radio dead, headlights flickering, dashboard gauges spinning randomly. I was stuck on a bridge built from human bones with something that didn't want me to leave. The handrails started vibrating under my hands. Not mechanical vibration, more like the metal was trying to speak, struggling to form words. When I pressed my ear against the steel beam, I could hear whispers. Dozens of voices, maybe hundreds, all talking at once, too quiet to understand. The first spirit. She appeared at the far end of the bridge, translucent and flickering like heat shimmer. A woman in 1918 clothing, her face gaunt from sickness. She was pointing at the bridge foundations and moving her mouth like she was shouting, but no sound reached me. More spirits appeared, Men, women, children, all from the flu epidemic era. They surrounded the bridge, pointing at the concrete, gesturing frantically at the spots where I'd taken my core samples. They looked angry and desperate, like they'd been trying to get someone's attention for 60 years. The bridge started shaking again, harder than before. Metal bolts popped loose and fell into the gorge. Sections of handrail bent and twisted like invisible hands were reshaping them. The road deck cracked, revealing more bone fragments embedded in the asphalt. Flew off the bridge by itself, spinning through the air before crashing into the trees below. My sample containers shattered, scattering bone fragments and concrete dust in the wind. The spirits were getting clearer, more solid. I could see their faces now, could read the desperation in their eyes. They'd been buried in a mass grave during the worst epidemic in modern history. Then their remains had been ground up and used as construction materials by contractors trying to save money. Prohibited propulsion, burial. They wanted to be treated like human beings instead of road aggregate. But they also wanted revenge on anyone who'd benefited from their desecration. And I was standing on a bridge built from their bones, documenting their gravesite like it was just another maintenance problem. Support cables snapped with sounds like rifle shots. A section of the bridge deck tilted sideways, and I had to grab the handrail to keep from sliding into the gorge. That's when I realized the truth that made everything infinitely worse. This wasn't the only bridge Blackwood's company had built. Construction records showed similar projects throughout the mountain region during the 1920s, all completed quickly and cheaply during economic hard times. How many other bridges were built on mass graves? How many other pieces of infrastructure in these mountains contained human remains as construction materials? The spirits weren't just angry about devils.
Fork Bridge.
They were angry about a systematic desecration that had been going on for decades, hidden in county records and construction archives that nobody bothered to check. And now that someone had finally discovered their secret, they weren't going to let me leave until I fixed it. Blinds tilted another 10 degrees. My truck slid sideways, tires screaming against metal. In another few minutes, the whole structure would collapse into the gorge with me on it. I had to make them understand that I wanted to help, not hide their story like everyone else had done for 60 years. "I know what happened to you," I shouted over the screaming metal. "I know about the mass grave. I know about Blackwood." The shaking stopped for a moment. The spirits turned toward me, their faces still angry but listening now. "Abidden Blackwood used your remains as construction materials," I continued, my voice echoing strangely in the sudden quiet. "He ground up your bones and mixed them into concrete to save money. You were never meant to be part of this bridge." The woman in 1918 clothing stepped closer. When she spoke, her voice sounded like wind through broken glass. 60 years. Forgotten. More voices joined hers, overlapping whispers that gradually became clearer. No names, no markers, no prayers. Ground us up like gravel. Used us to build roads for the living. They'd been trapped in the bridge structure since 1921, conscious and aware, but unable to communicate with the living world. Every car that crossed, every maintenance inspection, every casual use of their grave as a transportation route had been torture for them. But they'd also been learning, growing stronger, figuring out how to manipulate the physical world. The bone fragments I'd been finding weren't random. They were the spirits pushing pieces of themselves to the surface, trying to tell their story to anyone who'd listen. "I can help you," I said. "I can make sure you get proper burial. I can tell people what really happened." The bridge shuddered again, but differently now. Not violent shaking, more like a sigh of relief that made the whole structure settle and flex. But one spirit stepped forward from the group, and I recognized him from old newspaper photos. Ernest Blackwood himself, the contractor who desecrated their grave. His spirit looked different from the others, darker, more solid, radiating guilt and defensive anger. "Can't prove anything," he said. "Records, lost. Witnesses, dead. Nobody will believe. The other spirits turned on him, their translucent forms becoming sharper and more defined. 60 years of rage focused on the man who turned their final resting place into a construction project. But Blackwood wasn't backing down. Even in death, he was trying to cover up what he'd done. Cost, overruns, had to use local materials, he said. Continued. Nobody got hurt. Just old bones, already dead. Belgium Kevin rushed toward him, and the bridge convulsed like a living thing. Support beams twisted, cables snapped, and the entire structure tilted 30 degrees toward the gorge. My truck slid sideways until it hit the twisted handrail. Thanks wasn't just about proper burial anymore. This was 60 years of supernatural rage exploding into the physical world, and I was caught in the middle of it. The bridge deck cracked open like an eggshell. Concrete chunks fell into the gorge, revealing the human remains that had been used as foundation material. Skulls, rib cages, arm bones, all mixed together with standard construction aggregate to form the pillars that held up the bridge. I could see the mass grave now, exposed where the bridge foundations had been torn apart. Hundreds of bodies buried in layers, most without coffins or markers, victims of the 1918 flu, who died faster than they could be properly interred. The spirit of Ernest Blackwood was trying to flee, but the flu victims had him surrounded. They were pulling at him, tearing pieces of his ghostly form away like he'd torn apart their grave. "Wait!" I shouted. "Fighting him won't fix anything. You need to let the living world know what happened." The spirits paused, turning toward me again. "I'm a forest ranger," I said. "People trust my reports. If I document this properly, if I bring in archaeologists and investigators, you can get proper burial, and Blackwood's crimes can be exposed. But only if you don't destroy all the evidence by collapsing the bridge." For a long moment, nobody moved. The bridge hung at an impossible angle, defying physics, while the spirits decided whether to trust me or finish their revenge. The woman in 1918 proper, burial, all of us. Promise, memorial, with our names. Prominently, promise, tell the truth. "I promise," I said, and meant it completely, "but you have to let me live long enough to keep that promise." Minimized, the spirits of the flu victims nodded slowly. Then they turned back toward Ernest Blackwood. "Your time is done," the woman said. "No more hiding. No more lies." Blackwood's spirits screamed as they dragged him down into the exposed mass grave. The sound was like metal tearing, like glass breaking, like wind through empty houses. It echoed off the gorge walls and faded into silence. The bridge slowly straightened itself, metal beams bending back into proper alignment. The twisted handrails untwisted, the cracked deck sealed itself, the broken cables reattached. In 5 minutes, Devil's Fork Bridge looked almost normal again. But the exposed mass grave remained visible through gaps in the repaired foundation. The spirits wanted their story told, their remains properly honored. They trusted me to keep my promise. My truck started on the first try, all electrical systems working perfectly. As I drove away, I could see the spirits standing at both ends of the bridge, not blocking passage, but standing guard to make sure nobody else disturbed their rest until I could bring help. 3 weeks later, Devil's Fork Bridge was officially condemned and closed to all traffic. The state archaeological team I'd contacted found exactly what the spirits had shown me. Over 200 human remains mixed into the bridge foundations, along with construction records proving Ernest Blackwood had used the mass grave as a source of local aggregate materials. The victims were carefully exhumed and reburied in a proper cemetery, with individual markers where possible. The mass burial site got a memorial stone, listing all known names of 1918 flu victims from the area. Patricia Millstone recovered from her broken ankle, but she transferred to a different county afterward. She never talked about what happened on the bridge, but she did help me research other construction projects from that era. We found evidence of similar cost-cutting measures at 7 other bridges and 2 courthouse foundations throughout the mountain region, all built by Blackwood's company between 1919 and 1925, all during economic difficulties when contractors were pressured to finish quickly and cheaply. I spent the next 2 years investigating every piece of infrastructure in my jurisdiction that dated from that period. Found human remains mixed into construction materials at 4 more sites. Each time, we brought in archaeologists, identified the victims when possible, and provided proper burial. The spirits at those sites were grateful, not violent. Word had spread somehow, through whatever realm they inhabited, that someone was finally listening to their story. But Devil's Fork Bridge taught me something that changed how I approach my job forever. When people cut corners to save money, especially during desperate times, the consequences can last generations. Those flu victims had been forgotten for 60 years, their final rest disturbed for a construction project that could have been done properly, with just a little more time and expense. Blackwood saved maybe a few $100s by using human remains as road aggregate. That decision created 60 years of supernatural anguish and turned a necessary piece of infrastructure into a haunted trap. I still work as a forest ranger in these mountains, but now I research the history of every bridge and building I maintain. I check construction records, cemetery records, local obituaries from the period. When the past has been buried improperly, it has a way of surfacing when you least expect it. The new Devil's Fork Bridge was built half a mile upstream from the original site. It's a beautiful piece of modern engineering, constructed with proper environmental impact studies and archaeological surveys. No mass graves, no human remains in the foundation materials, no shortcuts that sacrifice respect for the dead. Sometimes I drive past the old bridge site, where the state left the exposed mass grave as part of the memorial. The silence is different now, peaceful instead of angry, like the forest has finally exhaled after holding its breath for decades. But I know there are other bridges in these mountains, other when contractors were tempted to use whatever materials came cheaply. The past has a way of making itself known when someone disturbs the wrong pile of bones or tears into the wrong foundation. My grandfather used to say that mountains remember everything, every tree cut, every stream diverted, every grave disturbed. The Appalachians are old mountains with long memories, and sometimes they demand that forgotten stories be told properly. I've learned to listen when the silence gets too deep, when metal feels colder than it should, when bones appear where bones shouldn't be. Because the dead deserve better than being ground up and mixed into concrete, and the living deserve to know when they're walking on graves. Every bridge tells a story. Most of them are just stories about engineering and construction, weather and maintenance. But some bridges tell stories about the people who were sacrificed to build them, forgotten and buried beneath steel and concrete. Those are the stories that matter most, because they're the ones nobody else wants to hear. If you ever find yourself on an old bridge in the mountains, and the silence gets too deep, and the metal feels too cold, pay attention. The dead have been waiting a long time for someone to listen. And always remember, every foundation has a history. Sometimes that history includes people who deserved better than becoming construction materials for the living world to drive across. Make sure their stories don't stay buried forever. My name is Daniel Crowfeather, and I've been protecting the water in these mountains for 15 years now. People always ask me why I chose this job, walking miles through thick forest, checking on streams and springs that most folks never even know exist. The truth is, water called to me long before I understood why. I'm half Cherokee, got my geology degree from NC State, and I know every drop of water in 50 square miles of the Pisgah National Forest. My grandmother used to say, water holds memory, but I always figured that was just old mountain talk. I studied the science of water, pH levels, mineral content, thermal stratification. I trusted my instruments more than old stories. Undergone before the summer of 1965, when the worst drought in 30 years changed everything I thought I knew. The mountains were dying that August. Springs that had run clear for centuries turned to dusty holes. Ancient oaks dropped their leaves early, and the wildlife grew desperate. But it was the call about Witch's Kettle Falls that brought me 6 miles deep into the forest on that blazing hot morning. The falls got their name from the old stories. Cherokee healers used to gather there for water ceremonies until the white settlers came. In the 1790s, 7 native women were accused of witchcraft and drowned in the pool below the falls. My grandmother always said those women weren't witches at all, just healers who knew the old ways with water and herbs. I'd been to the falls maybe 20 times over the years, 80 feet of granite cliff dropping into a perfectly round pool, surrounded by ancient rhododendron that bloomed pink every spring. The water stayed cold year-round, fed by underground springs that geologists still couldn't fully map. But when I finally reached the trail's end that morning, my breath caught in my throat. The drought had dropped the water level by at least 12 feet. For the first time in living memory, you could see the bottom of the pool. And there, arranged in a perfect circle on the granite floor, were human bones. 7 skulls, 7 rib cages, arm and leg bones, laid out like spokes of a wheel. Even from the rim, I could see they'd been placed there deliberately. This wasn't how bodies naturally settled after drowning. I set down my pack and pulled my false. But this was a little bit more from a future. The challenge was exactly where the labour. It was also had filts with a run stall, and the way they would been alter my back. I set, but the mountains blocked the signal as usual. 6 miles back to the truck, then another hour to the ranger station. By the time I could get the state archaeologist out here, it would be late afternoon. I decided to document what I could see from up top. Basic photographs, sketches of the bone arrangement, notes about the water level, standard archaeological site protection protocol. That's when I noticed something that made my hands shake as I wrote. The water level was rising. Not slowly, like you'd expect from an underground spring adjusting to pressure few minutes. I could actually watch it creep up the granite walls of the pool. I checked my instruments. Air temperature, 92 degrees, no wind, no recent rainfall in the entire watershed. According to everything I knew about hydrology, that water level should have been dropping, not rising. I knelt at the pool's edge and dipped my hand in to test the temperature. Ice cold. Not cool, not refreshing, cold enough to make my fingers go numb in seconds. In August, in a 90-degree heat wave, sitting in direct sunlight, that pool felt like it had been sitting in winter shade. I pulled out my pH meter and lowered it into the water. The digital readout flickered wildly, jumping from 7.2 to 3.4 to 9.8 in seconds. Impossible readings. Either my equipment was broken, or this water was defying every law of chemistry I knew. Harassed a sample bottle to test back at the lab, screwing the cap on tight. Within minutes, the water had completely evaporated, leaving only dry mineral residue in the bottom of the glass. My grandmother's voice whispered in my memory, "Water holds memory, Danny. Some water remembers things people want to forget." The bones were disappearing now as the water rose. By the time I finished taking photos, only the tops of the skulls showed above the surface. The pool looked normal again, just a beautiful mountain swimming hole. Prolific. But the wrongness hung in the air like humidity. The forest around the falls had gone completely silent. No birds, no insects, no wind in the leaves. Even the waterfall itself seemed muted, like sound was being absorbed by something I couldn't see. Poling. I shouldered my pack and started the long hike back, telling myself I'd seen equipment failure and maybe some kind of underground thermal event. There had to be a scientific explanation. I was still telling myself that when I looked back from the ridge and saw the water in the pool swirling slowly counterclockwise, even though there was no current to cause it. The state archaeologist, Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, arrived the next morning with a graduate student and enough equipment to run a full excavation. Beth and I had worked together before. She was tough, practical, and had zero patience for mountain folklore. "Me," she said as we hiked in, "that a drought exposed bones. Then the water level mysteriously rose to cover them again?" That's what I saw. I kept my tone professional, but I could hear how crazy it sounded. "Underground spring activity," she said firmly. "Pressure changes from the drought, probably. We'll pump the pool down and get proper documentation." On portable pump took 3 hours to lower the water enough to reach the bones. Beth worked methodically, photographing everything, taking measurements. The bone arrangement was even more complex than I'd realized from above. Not just a circle, but a spiral pattern with smaller artifacts placed between each skeleton. "These aren't drowning victims," Beth said, crouched over one of the skulls. "Look at these markings." I climbed down into the drained pool to see what she meant. Deep gouges scarred the back of each skull, the kind of damage you'd see from rocks or heavy clubs. These women had been beaten to death before their bodies went into the water. "Murder victims," I said quietly. "Execution victims, more likely. See how the bodies are positioned? This was ritual." Beth pointed to iron shackles still attached to several of the skeletons. "Colonial-era metalwork. Your grandmother's stories might not be folklore after all." That's when her graduate student, Mike, started shouting from the pool's edge. "Dr. Hartwell! The pump!" Misunderstanding. We looked up to see water pouring into the pool from every direction. Not from the waterfall. That was still just a trickle. This water was coming up through cracks in the granite, seeping through solid rock, flowing in from places where no water should exist. Bishops. The pump was running at full capacity, but the water level was rising faster than it could work. "Equipment failure," Beth said, but her voice lacked conviction. I waded to the pump and checked the connections. Everything was working perfectly. The machine was moving hundreds of gallons per minute, but the pool was filling like someone had opened a fire hydrant. "We need to get out of here," Mike said. The kid had good instincts. Firefight. But Beth was taking photos as fast as she could, trying to document everything before the rising water covered the evidence. Just a few more minutes. The water reached her knees, then her waist. Still ice cold despite the blazing sun overhead. I grabbed her arm. "Beth, we need to go, now." She nodded and started toward the pool's edge, but stopped suddenly. "Danny, look." The water around us had started moving in that same slow, counterclockwise spiral I'd seen the day before. But now I was standing in it, feeling the current pulling at my legs with impossible strength. "There's no current source," Beth whispered. "Water can't move like this without—" Fictional. The words died in her throat as she looked down at her feet. Through the clear, cold water, we could see one of the skulls directly below us. And in the empty eye sockets, small lights were beginning to glow. Not reflections. Light was coming from inside the bone. Blinds. Mike was screaming at us from the rim of the pool, but his voice sounded distant, like it was coming from underwater. The spiral current was getting stronger, and the water was still rising. I grabbed Beth's hand, and we fought our way toward the edge, but it felt like walking through thick mud. Something was holding the water back, making it resist our movement. When I looked over my shoulder, all 7 skulls were glowing now with that same pale, cold light. And in the surface of the water above them, shapes were starting to form. Faces, women's faces, looking up at us through the water like we were the ones at the bottom of a pool. Beth saw them too. Her grip on my hand tightened until I thought she'd break my fingers. The faces were moving their mouths, trying to speak, but we couldn't hear anything except the growing roar of water that shouldn't exist. One of them, a woman with long black hair and high cheekbones that looked Cherokee, reached up toward the surface, reached up toward Beth. The water was at our chests now. Mike had thrown us a rope, but every time we tried to grab it, the current pulled us back toward the center of the pool, back toward those glowing skulls and the faces in the water. I could feel something brushing against my legs. Not fish. The touch was too deliberate, too much like fingers. "Danny," Beth gasped. "I can't feel the bottom anymore." Finalize. She was right. The pool had been maybe 8 feet deep when we climbed in. Now it felt bottomless, like we were floating over an underground lake. The face with Cherokee features was getting clearer, more solid. She was wearing what looked like traditional clothing, and her mouth was moving faster now, more urgently. Suddenly, Beth went under. Blinds, not like she'd slipped or lost her footing. 1 second she was next to me, the next she was gone, pulled down by something I couldn't see. I dove after her, but the water was too murky now, too full of swirling sediment and strange light. I could hear Mike screaming from above, could feel the rope hitting the water near me, but all I could think about was finding Beth. She surfaced once, 20 feet away, gasping and coughing. "Something grabbed me," she shouted. "Something unpredicting." Then she went under again. This time, I saw what took her. A hand, pale and transparent, but solid enough to drag a grown woman into the depths. A hand that belonged to one of the faces in the water. Rectangular, and hauled myself toward the edge, knowing I couldn't save her if I drowned too. Mike pulled me out just as Beth surfaced again at the very center of the pool. She wasn't fighting anymore. Her eyes were wide and strange, like she was seeing something we couldn't. Water poured from her mouth when she tried to speak, but I could make out one word. Memory. Perceptions. In the water smiled, and Beth sank into the depths like a stone. We called in the dive team from Asheville, but they never found Beth's body. The pool measured exactly 8 feet deep, just like it always had. The water was normal temperature, normal pH, normal in every way that mattered to their instruments. But I knew what I'd seen, and when the sheriff questioned me about Dr. Hartwell's disappearance, I told him she'd had equipment failure and drowned during the excavation. I didn't mention the faces in the water or the impossible current. Crimson. Some truths are too big for official reports. Melancad Beth walked out of the forest. She was soaked through, hypothermic, with pine needles in her hair, and no memory of what had happened after she went under. The doctors said it was miraculous. People don't survive 3 days of exposure in August without water or shelter. But Beth had no explanation for where she'd been or how she'd survived. She did have were the memories. "I saw them, Danny," she told me when I visited her in the hospital. "The 7 women. I saw what really happened at those falls." Her voice was different now, quieter, with an odd echo, like she was speaking from the bottom of a well. They weren't teachers, Cherokee women who knew the old ceremonies for blessing water and keeping it clean. The colonists were getting sick from their own wells, dying of diseases they brought with them. But near the Cherokee settlements, the water stayed pure. She stared at the ceiling, her eyes unfocused. The colonists decided the women were cursing their water with witchcraft. On August 15th, 1793, they dragged 7 healers to the falls and beat them to death with stones. Then they threw the bodies into the pool, thinking they could break whatever power the women had over the water. "Beth," I said gently, "you need to rest." The doctors said, but they made it worse. Her voice got stronger, more urgent. The women's spirits bound themselves to that water, not for revenge, for protection. They're still there, Danny, still guarding the sacred spring. I wanted to tell her it was trauma, hallucinations brought on by near drowning and exposure. But I'd seen those faces too. "The drought wasn't natural," she continued. "Something's been poisoning the watershed, killing the springs. The Guardians are trying to show us what's happening." That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Beth's, about the equipment failures and impossible water levels. Finally, around 3 in the morning, I drove back out to the trailhead. The hike in darkness took 4 hours, following my flashlight beam through familiar paths. I reached the falls just as dawn was breaking through the rhododendron. The pool looked normal in the early morning light. Peaceful, beautiful, exactly the way it had always been. Birds were singing again, and the forest felt alive. But when I knelt at the water's edge, my reflection wasn't alone. She was standing behind me in the reflection, the Cherokee woman I'd seen in the pool during Beth's disappearance. In the mirror of the water's surface, I could see her clearly. Traditional dress, long black hair, and eyes that held centuries of sadness. When I turned around, nothing was there. But in the reflection, she raised her hand and pointed downstream, toward the main river. I followed her direction, hiking down through the forest until I reached the place where the stream from Witch's Kettle Falls joined the larger Pisgah River. What I found there made my blood turn cold. Someone had been dumping chemicals into the water. 50-gallon drums, dozens of them, stacked behind a screen of planted pines that hid them from the main trail. Industrial waste from a paper mill 30 miles away, trucked in during the night and dumped where they thought no one would notice. Chemicals were killing everything downstream: fish, plants, the microorganisms that kept the water clean. It was poison, pure and simple, and it had been going on for months. I documented everything with my camera, took water samples from above and below the dump site, recorded GPS coordinates. By the time I hiked back out to call the State Environmental Agency, I had enough evidence to shut down the operation and fine the company into bankruptcy. But that night, I had another visitor. I was lying in bed, still processing what I'd discovered, when my bedroom filled with the sound of running water. Not from my pipes. This was the sound of a mountain stream, clear and musical and impossible. She was standing at the foot of my bed, the Cherokee healer from the pool, solid now instead of just a reflection. Water dripped from her hair and clothes, pooling on my floor without leaving any stain. "You have seen," she said, and her voice carried the echo of deep springs and ancient ceremonies. I should have been terrified, but all I felt was a strange sense of recognition, like I was talking to a relative I'd never met. "The poison," I said. "You were trying to show us." She nodded. "Water holds memory. We remember when it ran clean, when the fish swam and the people came to drink and be healed. Now it carries death. I'll stop them. I have evidence. Evidence alone will not be enough." She moved closer, and the temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. "They will find other places, other ways to poison the sacred waters. You must learn the old ceremonies, the true ways to protect what should be protected." I thought of my grandmother, Rishan. I don't know how. Man smiled, and for a moment, the sadness left her eyes. "You are Cherokee. The knowledge sleeps in your blood. We will teach you, as we taught your grandmother, as she would have taught you if you had listened." She raised her hand, and water began flowing from her palm. Not gushing, but a gentle, steady stream that should have been impossible. "But first, you must help us rest. We have guarded these waters for 2 centuries. We are tired." "What do you need me to do?" "Come to the falls tomorrow night. Bring tobacco and sage, cornmeal and spring water. Perform the water blessing ceremony your grandmother taught you." "She never taught me any ceremony." Spirit's smile widened. "She taught you every time she made you help her in the garden, every time she had you carry water to the plants, every time she made you say thank you to the creek before you drank. You know more than you think." When I blinked, she was gone. Only the scent of mountain laurel and the sound of distant streams remained. I spent the next day gathering what I needed and trying to remember my grandmother's rituals. She died when I was 16, but now pieces of her teachings were coming back to me. Words she'd whispered over sick plants, gestures she'd made when blessing water for cooking, the way she'd always faced east when praying. As the sun set, I hiked back to Witch's Kettle Falls, carrying a leather pouch filled with tobacco, sage, cornmeal, and a jar of spring water from the highest peak in the forest. The weight of the pouch felt right against my hip, like I'd been carrying it my whole life. The pool glowed silver in the moonlight, perfectly still and reflecting the stars. No sign of the spirits, no strange currents or impossible temperatures. Just a beautiful mountain pool on a quiet summer night. But when I knelt at the water's edge and emptied the pouch's contents into my palm, they were all there. 7 women standing in a circle around the pool, their feet resting on the water's surface like it was solid ground. The Cherokee healer who'd visited me was among them, but the others were different. younger and older, wearing the clothes of different eras. These weren't just the women who died in 1793. These were all the healers who'd come before, all the water keepers who'd protected this place for generations. "You have come," said the familiar voice of my midnight visitor. Complexion. I nodded, suddenly understanding that this moment had been building my entire life. Every stream I'd protected, every watershed I'd fought to preserve, had been leading to this. "I don't know the words," I admitted. "The words will come," said another spirit, an elderly woman with silver hair and eyes like deep lakes. "Speak from the place your grandmother planted in your heart." I stood and faced east, the way I'd seen my grandmother do countless times. The pouch felt warm in my hands as I opened it and began to sprinkle the contents on the water. "Recognize tobacco for the spirits," I said, and the words came from somewhere deeper than memory. "Sage for purification, cornmeal for nourishment, spring water for life." With each offering, the pool began to glow brighter. Not the cold, pale light I'd seen during Beth's disappearance, but a warm, golden radiance that seemed to rise from the very bottom of the water. "We offer these gifts in gratitude," I continued, the words flowing through me like they'd been waiting decades to be spoken. "For the water that gives life, for the streams that carry away what we cannot bear, for the springs that remember what we have forgotten." The 7 spirits moved closer, their forms becoming more solid, more present. I could see their faces clearly now, not faces of the dead, but faces of the living, of women who had chosen to stay and guard what they loved most. "We ask permission," I said, "to serve as you have served, to protect what should be protected, to remember what should be remembered, to keep the water clean for all who come after us." Kennedy, the elderly spirit woman, stepped forward and reached out to touch my forehead. Her hand was cold but not unpleasant, like diving into a mountain spring on a hot day. "You are accepted," she said. "The water will remember you now. When it is threatened, you will know. When it calls, you will answer." I felt something change inside me, not painful, but profound, like a door opening in my mind, or a river finding a new channel to the sea. Suddenly I could feel every stream in the watershed, every spring and creek and hidden waterway. They were all connected, all part of a vast network that pulsed with life. And I could feel the places where that network was damaged, where chemicals and waste were poisoning the flow. Not just the illegal dump I'd found, but dozens of other contamination sites throughout the mountains. The water was crying out for help. "This is your burden now," said the Cherokee healer, "but also your gift. The water will teach you its secrets, show you how to heal what has been harmed." 1+, one by one, the spirits began to fade, their duty finally passed to living hands. But before they disappeared completely, the elderly woman spoke once more. "When your time comes to rest, teach another. The chain must not be broken." As the last spirit vanished into the moonlight, the pool settled into perfect stillness. But now I could see what I'd never noticed before. Threads of light running through the water, connections to every stream and spring for miles around. A living map of the watershed, pulsing with information about temperature, pollution levels, wildlife health. I was no longer just a forest ranger who studied water. I was a keeper of the sacred springs, a guardian of the mountain's most precious resource. And I had work to do. That was 30 years ago. I retired from the Forest Service in 1985, but I never stopped protecting the water. My official title might have changed, but my real job, the one the spirits gave me, continues every day. The illegal dumping operation was shut down within a week of my report. The paper company paid the largest environmental fine in North Carolina history, and 3 executives went to prison. But that was just the beginning. Over the years, I've stopped dozens of contamination attempts, using both legal channels and older methods the spirits taught me. Sometimes a well-timed phone call to the EPA is enough. Sometimes I have to perform ceremonies that convince the polluters their operations are cursed. Both approaches surprisingly well. Beth never fully recovered from her time in the pool. The doctors said she was fine, but she left archaeology and moved to the mountains, becoming a traditional healer herself. We work together now, combining scientific knowledge with the old ways. She says the spirits still visit her dreams, teaching her which plants heal and which waters hold the strongest medicine. The Witch's Kettle Falls is protected now, designated as a sacred site under the Native American Graves Protection Act. No more archaeological expeditions, no more casual hikers, just the water and the forest and the memory of what happened there. But sometimes, especially during droughts or when the watershed faces new threats, people report seeing lights in the pool at night. 7 women standing on the water, watching, waiting, ready to protect what they've guarded for centuries. I visit the falls every full moon to perform the water blessing ceremony, maintaining the connection between the living and the spirits who chose to stay. My daughter comes with me sometimes. She's a hydrologist now, working for the State Environmental Agency. She doesn't see the spirits yet, but she feels them. The water calls to her the way it called to me. When my time comes to rest, she'll be ready to take on the guardianship. The chain will continue, as it must. People often ask me if I believe in ghosts, if I think the old Cherokee stories are real. I tell them I believe in water, in its power to remember and heal and connect all living things. I believe in the responsibility we have to protect what sustains us. Whether you call that science or spirituality doesn't matter much to the water. It just wants to run clean. But late at night, when I'm checking the streams and springs in my territory, I sometimes hear voices in the sound of flowing water, voices speaking in Cherokee and English, sharing the ancient knowledge of how to keep the sacred springs pure. And I remember my grandmother's words. Water holds memory, Danny. Some water runs too deep for modern understanding. The water remembers everything. And now, so do I. You ever find yourself hiking in the North Carolina mountains and come across a pool that feels too cold, water that moves without current, or streams that seem to whisper your name? Listen carefully. The spirits are still there, still protecting what should be protected. And they're always looking for new guardians to join their eternal watch over the sacred waters of the mountains. My name is Thomas Oakenshield, and I've been a forest ranger for 18 years. Before that, I spent 12 years as a Kentucky state trooper. In all that time, I thought I'd seen everything the mountains could throw at me. Drug labs, illegal hunters, missing hikers, drunk teenagers getting lost in caves. I was wrong. Ghost stories. Every hollow has its legend, every old cabin has its spirit, every moonshine still has its curse. I never believed any of it. When local folks told me about Devil's Hollow and the cursed still that ran itself, I just nodded and made notes about another illegal distillery to bust. That was before September of 1987, before the heat wave that turned the Daniel Boone National Forest into a tinderbox. Before I walked into that narrow valley 20 miles from the nearest backup and learned that some family feuds never really end. Back in the Red River Gorge, tucked between 2 steep ridges covered in oak and pine. There's only one way in on foot, following an old deer trail that winds between limestone cliffs. The hollow got its name from the way sound echoes there. Locals say you can hear the devil himself laughing when the wind's just right. The federal boys at ATF had been getting reports about this place for months. Hikers smelling that sweet mash scent that means someone's cooking moonshine. But every time they sent agents in, they found nothing. Empty caves, cold fire pits, old equipment that looked like it hadn't been used in years. That's where I came in. See, I knew these mountains better than any Fed ever would. I'd busted 43 illegal stills in my career. I knew the signs, the hiding spots, the tricks moonshiners used to avoid detection. The ATF figured a local ranger might have better luck. I drove out to the trailhead on a Tuesday morning in September. The temperature was already pushing 90 degrees at 8 a.m., and there hadn't been a drop of rain in 6 weeks. Every step on the trail sent up puffs of dust. The leaves were starting to turn brown early, and even the creek that usually ran through the hollow was down to a trickle. The smell hit me before I'd gone half a mile. Sweet and sharp, like overripe fruit mixed with grain alcohol. But there was something else underneath it, something that made my stomach turn, like meat that had been left out too long in the heat. I'd smelled plenty of moonshine operations before. This was different, wrong somehow. The trail wound down between two big limestone outcrops, and suddenly I was in the hollow. It was quieter than it should have been. No birds singing, no squirrels chattering, no insects buzzing. Even that little trickle of creek water seemed to whisper instead of babble. The first thing I saw was the still. It sat right out in the open next to the creek, not hidden at all. Big copper pot, maybe 50 gallons, with a coil condenser running through a wooden barrel. Steam was rising from the top, and I could hear the steady drip, drip, drip of fresh moonshine falling into a collection jar. But there was nobody around. No fire under the pot that I could see, but the thing was definitely running. The copper was so hot it glowed faintly in the morning shadows. While I pulled out my radio to call it in, but all I got was static, mixed with what sounded like someone reciting a recipe in a language I didn't recognize. The words were old and harsh, nothing like the modern English or even the mountain dialect I was used to. I walked closer to get a better look. The still looked old, real old. The copper was green with age in spots, and there were scratches and dents that spoke of decades of use. Someone had carved dates into the wooden stand. 1932, 1933, 1934. Then nothing until 1987. Brightness. That made my skin crawl a little. But what really got to me were the bones. They were mixed right into the mash, floating in the fermentation barrels like some kind of sick seasoning. Human bones, from the look of them. Finger bones, pieces of skull, what might have been ribs. All ground up and stirred into the corn mash like it was the most natural thing in the world. I'd seen drug operations do some twisted things, but this was something else entirely. This was sick, wrong in a way that went deeper than just breaking federal liquor laws. That's when I heard the voices. Faint at far away, two men arguing in thick mountain accents. Something about territory, about who had the right to work this hollow. The words echoed off the limestone cliffs, but when I looked around I couldn't see anyone. Safeguard. The voices got louder, angrier. I caught fragments. "This here's McCoy land," and "Hatfield corn, Hatfield still." The old feud families. But that didn't make sense. The last of the feuding McCoys and Hatfields had died out decades ago. I was starting to think maybe I'd spent too much time in the sun when I saw the fresh moonshine dripping from the condenser coil. The jar underneath was almost full, clear as mountain spring water. Without thinking about it, I reached out to test the proof. The moment my finger touched that liquid, the arguing voices stopped dead. The whole hollow went silent. Not peaceful quiet, but the kind of silence that comes right before something terrible happens. And I swear I heard someone whisper my name. I jerked my hand back like I'd been burned. The moonshine on my finger felt ice cold, even though I'd just seen steam rising from the still. I wiped it off on my pants and tried to think like a professional. Someone was playing games with me. Had to be. Maybe they had speakers hidden in the rocks, trying to scare me off with fake ghost voices. It wouldn't be the first time moonshiners used local legends to keep law enforcement away. But that still bothered me. It was running without any visible heat source, and the temperature inside had to be close to 200 degrees to produce that much steam. I walked around it twice, looking for hidden gas lines or electric heating elements. Nothing. I decided to check the caves. Every hollow in this part of Kentucky has limestone caves, and moonshiners love to hide their operations underground where satellites can't spot them. The voices might be echoing from deeper inside the mountain. The cave entrance was maybe 30 yards from the still, hidden behind a screen of mountain laurel. I pulled out my flashlight and ducked inside. The tunnel was narrow at first, barely wide enough for my shoulders, but it opened up after about 20 feet. What I found inside made me forget all about hidden speakers. There were more stills, dozens of them, stretching back into the darkness like some kind of underground distillery. Most looked old enough to be from Prohibition days, crude copper pots welded together with whatever materials the makers could find. But they were all running, all producing that steady drip of clear liquor. And there wasn't a soul in sight. I played my flashlight beam along the cave walls and saw names carved into the stone. McCoy, Hatfield, dates going back to the 1920s, crude drawings of guns and coffins, messages like "Death to all Hatfields" and "McCoy blood will flow." The smell was stronger in here. That sweet mash scent was almost overwhelming, but underneath it was something else. Something that reminded me of the morgue back when I was a state trooper. The smell of death that's been sitting around too long. I followed the cave system deeper, counting stills as I went. 37 in total, all running, all producing moonshine that dripped into collection jars that never seemed to overflow. Some of the equipment looked like it had been there since the 1930s, but it was all working perfectly. That's when I found the bodies. They were in a side chamber, maybe 50 feet from the main cave. 2 men, or what was left of them. One was slumped over a still, his skeletal hands still gripping a copper ladle. The other was lying on his back near the cave wall, a rusted shotgun across his chest. Both were wearing clothes that looked like they'd been inside ago. Overalls, work boots, flannel shirts that had rotted away to threads. And both had bullet holes in their skulls. I was reaching for my radio when I heard footsteps behind me. Heavy boots on stone, moving slow and deliberate. I spun around, hand going to my service weapon, but the tunnel was empty. Just my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. "Hello?" I called out. "This is Ranger Oakenshield with the Forest Service. You need to come out where I can see you." The footsteps stopped. For a moment, the only sound was that constant dripping from all the stills. Then I heard breathing. Slow, raspy, like someone who'd been underground too long. "This ain't your hollow, Ranger." The voice came from everywhere at once, echoing off the cave walls, so I couldn't tell where it originated. Mountain accent, thick as molasses, mad as hell. "This here's McCoy land. Always has been, always will be." "Sir, I need you to come out where I can see you," I called back, trying to keep my voice steady. "This is federal land, and you're operating an illegal distillery." Echoed through the caves. Not the kind of laughter you hear from someone who thinks something's funny, the kind that comes from someone who's been driven completely insane. "Federal land? Boy, my family's been making shine in this hollow since before your granddaddy was born. Ain't no government gonna tell a McCoy where he can and can't work." Unless another voice joined in from a different direction. "McCoy? You're on Hatfield ground, you son of a bitch." "The hell I am. Ceremonial, been telling you for 60 years, this still belongs to my family." "Prescribe." The voices got louder, angrier. I could hear them moving around in the darkness, but every time I pointed my flashlight toward the sound, I saw nothing but empty tunnel. That's when the shooting started. Gunshots boomed through the cave system, echoing off the walls until it sounded like a full-scale war. I dove for cover behind one of the old stills, pulling out my radio. Still nothing but static. The shots came from 2 different directions, and I could hear the bullets ricocheting off stone walls. But I couldn't see any muzzle flashes, couldn't see anyone doing the shooting. "You killed my brother, Hatfield. Your brother was a thief and a murderer. I'll see you in hell." More shots. I counted at least 20 rounds fired, but none of them came anywhere near me. It was like I wasn't even there, like they were fighting some battle that had nothing to do with me. Then, as suddenly as it started, everything went quiet. I stayed behind that still for a full 5 minutes, listening for any sound of movement. Nothing. The constant dripping from the stills seemed louder now, like it was the only sound left in the world. When I finally worked up the nerve to stand up, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Fresh bullet holes in the cave wall, right where those voices had been arguing. The stone was still smoking where the lead had hit it, but there were no shell casings on the ground, no gunpowder smell in the air, no signs that anyone had been there at all. I got out of that cave as fast as my legs would carry me, not caring how it looked. Professional or not, some things are beyond normal law enforcement procedures. But when I emerged into daylight, I found something waiting for me that was somehow worse than invisible gunfighters. Agent Sandra Mitchell from the ATF was standing next to the main still, holding a jar of fresh moonshine and looking at me like I'd lost my mind. "Ranger Oakenshield, I heard gunshots. What's your status?" I tried to explain what I'd found in the caves, but it sounded crazy even to me. Invisible moonshiners, voices with no bodies, stills that ran themselves. Mitchell listened with the kind of patience you show someone who's clearly been in the sun too long. Then she lifted the jar she was holding. I found this sitting right here when I arrived. Still warm from the distillation process. Quality looks good. She unscrewed the cap and sniffed it. Smells clean, high proof, probably around 150. "Don't," I started to say, but she was already raising the jar to her lips. She took a small sip, then a larger one. Her eyes lit up like she'd found something wonderful. "This is the best moonshine I've ever tasted," she said, taking another drink. "Smooth as silk, no burn at all." Then she smiled at me, and I saw something in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Something hungry and mean. "Want some, Ranger? Tastes like family." Minimized. Mitchell took another drink from the jar, and I watched her change. Not physically, not at first, but something shifted behind her eyes, like someone else was looking out through them. "Agent Mitchell, I need you to put that down," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "We don't know what's in it." She laughed, but it wasn't her laugh. It was rough and harsh, like the voices I'd heard in the cave. "What's in it? This here's pure McCoy corn liquor, made from my granddaddy's recipe. Best moonshine in these mountains." That's when I noticed her accent. Agent Mitchell was from Ohio, talked like a city person. But now she was speaking pure mountain dialect, thick as the locals who'd grown up in these hills. "Sandra," I said carefully, "you need to put the jar down and step away from the still." "Sandra?" She looked confused for a moment, like she'd forgotten her own name. Then that strange smile came back. "Name's Emma McCoy, and this here's my family's hollow." She raised the jar again, but this time I was ready for her. I lunged forward and knocked it out of her hands. The jar shattered against the rocks, and moonshine splashed everywhere it touched. The moment the jar broke, Mitchell screamed. Not like someone in pain, but like an animal caught in a trap. She fell to her knees, clutching her head with both hands. What happened?" she gasped, her normal voice coming back. "Where am I?" I helped her stand up, but she was shaky on her feet. "You drank some of the moonshine. Do you remember anything?" She shook her head, then stopped and looked around the hollow with growing horror. There were people here, a woman in old-fashioned clothes. She was so angry, Thomas, angry about something that happened a long time ago. That's when we both heard it, the sound of more glass breaking, coming from deeper in the hollow. Then another crash, and another, like someone was smashing every jar they could find. "The caves," I said. "There are more stills in the caves." Mitchell pulled out her service weapon. Whatever had happened to her, it had shaken her badly. Her hands were trembling as she checked the magazine. "We need to call for backup," she said. I showed her my radio. Still nothing but static, and those strange voices reciting recipes in languages I couldn't understand. Her radio was the same. "We're 20 miles from the nearest road," I told her. "Even if we could get a signal out, it would be hours before anyone could reach us." She looked at the broken still, then back toward the cave entrance. So what do we do? Before I could answer, we heard footsteps. Real ones this time, heavy boots on stone, coming from the direction of the cave. But these weren't trying to hide. They were marching toward us like soldiers heading into battle. Two figures emerged from the cave entrance, and for a moment I thought they were real people. They looked solid enough. An old man in dirty overalls, and a woman in a faded dress that might have been blue once. Both carrying shotguns that looked like they'd been made sometime around World War I. But I could see through them, just barely, like looking through dirty glass, but enough to know they weren't entirely there. The woman spoke first, her voice carrying across the hollow like it was coming from a loudspeaker. "Hatfields, you've been stealing from McCoy stills for the last time." The old man raised his shotgun. "Emma McCoy, your family murdered my boys. Time to pay the price." They started shooting at each other, just like in the cave. But this time, I could see the ghosts pulling the triggers, see the phantom muzzle flashes, see the way the shots passed right through them without doing any damage. "Run," I told Mitchell. We took off toward the trail, but more figures were emerging from the caves now. Dozens of them, all carrying weapons, all wearing clothes from the 1930s. The hollow filled with the sound of gunfire and angry voices, the feuding families continuing their war 60 years after they'd killed each other. A shot whined past my ear, close enough that I felt the wind from it. I looked back and saw one of the ghosts, a young man with a McCoy face, aiming directly at me. "They think we're part of the feud," I shouted to Mitchell as we ran up the trail. "They think we're Hatfields." More shots followed us as we climbed out of the hollow. Real bullets, fired by phantom guns, guided by the hatred of people who refused to stay dead. One shattered a tree branch right next to my head. Another kicked up dust at my feet. We made it to my truck without getting killed, but when I tried to start it, nothing happened. The engine was completely dead, like someone had drained the battery. Mitchell was checking her gear, taking inventory. "Okay," she said, trying to sound professional. "We've got 2 service weapons, maybe 60 rounds total. My satellite phone is dead. Radio's useless. What else do you know about this place?" I told her about the local legends. The McCoy and Hatfield families who'd feuded over moonshine territory back in the 1930s. How they'd supposedly killed each other off in this very hollow, leaving no survivors from either side. "But they weren't supposed to be able to affect the physical world," I said. "Ghosts don't shoot real bullets." "Those bullets felt real enough," Mitchell said, touching a tear in her jacket where one had passed through. That's when we noticed the smoke. It was rising from the direction of the hollow, thick and black like something big was burning. We could smell it from half a mile away, that sweet moonshine smell, but mixed with something chemical and toxic. "The stills," I said. "Something's happening to the stills." We hiked back toward the hollow, moving carefully and staying in cover. What we found was worse than the gunfight. Every still was running at full capacity, producing moonshine faster than I'd ever seen. The fires underneath them were burning so hot the copper was starting to melt, and the moonshine wasn't clear anymore. It was dark red, the color of blood. The ghosts were still there, but they weren't fighting each other now. They were working together, all of them focused on the stills, feeding things into the mash that I didn't want to look at too closely. Bones, probably. Maybe other things. And they were looking at us. "They know we're here," Mitchell whispered. The old man who'd called himself a Hatfield pointed at us with one skeletal finger. When he spoke, his voice carried across the hollow like thunder. "Outsiders," he said, "come to steal our family secrets, come to destroy what we've built." Emma McCoy nodded. "They've tasted our shine. They know our ways. Can't let them leave." Ghosts turned toward us then, and I saw the truth in their transparent faces. They weren't just continuing their feud, they were protecting something bigger. Something they'd created together after death had failed to stop their hatred. "They're not enemies anymore," I told Mitchell. "They're working together." Working together to do what? Before I could answer, the first jar of that blood-red moonshine finished filling. One of the ghosts lifted it up like he was making a toast. "To family," he said, "and to all who would join our family." He poured the contents onto the ground, and where the liquid touched, the earth began to change. Grass withered and died, rocks cracked and split, and something underneath started pushing up toward the surface, something that looked like more bones. "We need to get out of here," I said, "now." But when we turned to run, we found our path blocked. More ghosts had appeared on the trail behind us, dozens of them, filling the narrow passage between the cliffs. We were trapped in Devil's Hollow with the angry spirits of two feuding families who had decided we knew too much to live. And they were still making moonshine that could bring the dead back to life. The ghosts formed a circle around us, their weapons pointed inward. I counted at least 30 of them, men and women ranging from teenagers to elderly, all wearing the clothes they died in 60 years ago. Most had bullet wounds visible in their transparent bodies. "You drank our shine," Emma McCoy said, her voice echoing off the limestone cliffs. "That makes you family, McCoy family." "Like hell," growled the old Hatfield patriarch. "They're on my land. That makes them mine." Freezes. For a moment I thought they were going to start fighting each other again, but Emma shook her head. "We settled this, remember? After we all died, after we found out what really mattered. It ain't about McCoy or Hatfield anymore. It's about keeping the family together." She gestured toward the stills, where that blood-red moonshine continued to drip into waiting jars. "Every drop of shine we make, every soul that drinks it, becomes part of us. Forever." Mitchell raised her weapon, but I put a hand on her arm. "They're already dead," I whispered. "Bullets won't stop them." "Then what will?" Before I could answer, one of the younger ghosts stepped forward. He couldn't have been more than 16 when he died, but his eyes held decades of hatred. "Time for you to choose," he said. "Drink the shine and join the family willing-like, or we'll make you drink it." "What happens to people who drink it?" I asked, though I was pretty sure I already knew. Emma smiled, and for the first time I could see through her completely. She was fading as the sun got lower, becoming more transparent by the minute. "They become one of us," she said. "Their hatred feeds our existence. Their anger keeps the stills running. Their souls power our revenge." Battlefield. Revenge against who? Your enemies are all dead. "Against everyone," the old Hatfield said. "Against the government that tried to shut us down. Against the law that said our family traditions were crimes. Against anyone who thinks they can tell us how to live." I looked at the stills again, really looked at them. The design was wrong. These weren't just moonshine operations. They were some kind of supernatural machinery. The bones in the mash weren't just ingredients, they were fuel. Human souls converted into spiritual energy, powering a process that kept the dead angry enough to stay in this world. "How many people have you turned?" I asked. Emma began counting on her fingers. "There was that hiking couple last spring, the federal agent who came before you, 3 boys from town who thought they could steal our shine. Maybe 15, 20 souls in the past year. All added to the family," the young ghost said. "All helping us make more shine, bring more souls into the fold." Mitchell was looking around desperately, searching for an escape route, but the ghosts had us completely surrounded. There was nowhere to run. Blinds. "The only way this ends," I said quietly, "is if we destroy the stills." "They're made of copper and steel," she whispered back. "How do we destroy them with bare hands?" That's when I remembered the explosives in my truck. Standard issue for rangers who sometimes had to clear fallen trees from trails. Not much, but maybe enough. "I need to get back to my vehicle," I told her. "Thomas, those things aren't going to let us walk away." She was right, but I also noticed something else. The ghosts were getting more solid as the sun went down, more dangerous, but also more vulnerable. "When they're fully solid," I said, "they can be hurt. That's when we make our move." Emma must have heard us talking because she stepped closer. I could smell the grave dirt on her clothes, see the bullet hole in her temple where some Hatfield had put a round through her skull. "No more talking," she said. "Time to drink." One of the male ghosts lifted a jar of the blood-red moonshine and moved toward us. The liquid inside swirled like it was alive, and I could swear I heard voices coming from it. Tiny, distant screams. "I'll go first," I told Mitchell. "Create a distraction." She nodded, understanding what I meant. When the ghost got close enough, I was going to fight back. It would probably get me killed, but it might give her a chance to reach the explosives. When everything changed, the temperature dropped 20 degrees in about 2 seconds. Every ghost in the hollow suddenly looked terrified, their transparent faces turning towards something behind us. I spun around and saw her walking down the trail. A woman in a white dress, glowing with soft light that hurt to look at directly. Unlike the other spirits, she wasn't transparent at all. She looked completely, perfectly alive. "Mama?" Emma whispered, her voice suddenly small and frightened. "Grandmother McCoy," breathed one of the other ghosts. "But you moved on. You found peace." White stopped at the edge of the circle. When she spoke, her voice was gentle, but carried absolute authority. "I did find peace," she said, "until I felt what you children were doing in my hollow." "We're keeping the family together, Mama," Emma said, "just like you always taught us." "This isn't family," the woman said, gesturing toward the stills and the trapped souls. "This is abomination. You're not honoring our traditions. You're perverting them." "Colorful, the Hatfields killed your sons," the young ghost protested. "They murdered our kin." "And my sons killed their kin right back," the woman replied. "Death for death, blood for blood, until there was nothing left but hatred. Is that what you want? To spend eternity trapped in the worst moment of your lives?" Pension, she turned to the Hatfield patriarch. "Jeremiah Hatfield, I knew your mother. She was a good woman who raised good children. Would she be proud of what you've become?" The old man's shotgun wavered. For the first time since I'd seen him, he looked uncertain. "They started it," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "And you'll finish it," the woman said. "Right here, right now. Choose forgiveness over revenge. Choose peace over endless war. Choose to let go." Escalating. "But if we let go," Emma said, "we'll disappear. We'll be nothing." "You'll be free," her grandmother said gently. "Free to move on to whatever comes next. Free to rest." The circle of ghosts began to waver. Some were already fading, choosing to release their hold on the physical world. Others held firm, still clinging to their hatred. "The stills," I said to the woman in white, "they're powered by the souls of people who drank the cursed moonshine. If your family moves on, what happens to them?" She smiled sadly. "They'll be freed too. Death should not be a prison ranger for anyone." That's when Emma raised her shotgun and pointed it at her grandmother. "I won't let you destroy what we built," she snarled. "I won't let you take our family away." The other holdout ghosts raised their weapons too. About half the total, maybe 15 spirits, who refused to give up their anger. "Then you've chosen," the woman in white said. "But I won't let you trap more innocent souls in your web of hatred." She walked toward the stills, and the rebellious ghosts opened fire. Their bullets passed right through her without causing any damage. Whatever she was beyond their ability to harm. When she reached the first still, she placed her hands on the copper pot. The metal began to crack and split, the supernatural fire underneath guttering out. The blood-red moonshine stopped flowing. "No!" Emma screamed, rushing toward her grandmother. But the moment she touched the woman in white, Emma burst into flames. Not real fire, spiritual fire that burned away her anger and hatred, leaving nothing but a confused young woman who suddenly remembered what it felt like to love instead of hate. "I'm sorry, Mama," she whispered, and then she was gone. Not destroyed, but released. Free. The other rebellious ghosts made their choice. Some ran toward their grandmother's light and found peace. Others fled back into the caves, choosing to remain trapped in their hatred. Behind the time it was over, all the stills were destroyed. The trapped souls, including Agent Mitchell's temporary possession, were freed. The supernatural machinery that had powered the feud was nothing but twisted metal and cold stone. The woman in white turned to us one last time. "Thank you," she said, "for caring enough to come here, for being willing to risk yourselves to free the trapped souls." "Will they come back?" Mitchell asked. "The ones who fled into the caves?" The woman shook her head. "Without the stills, they have no power to affect the physical world. They'll fade eventually, when their hatred finally burns itself out. But they can't hurt anyone anymore." She began to fade as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. "Confiscated. Remember this place," she said. "Remember what hatred can do when it refuses to die. And remember that forgiveness is always stronger than revenge." Then she was gone, and we were alone in Devil's Hollow, with nothing but broken stills and the smell of moonshine slowly evaporating in the mountain air. We walked out of Devil's Hollow in silence. My truck started on the first try, like nothing had ever been wrong with it. Our radios worked perfectly, picking up the normal chatter of rangers and federal agents going about their daily business. The official report was simple enough. Agent Mitchell and I had discovered an illegal distillery operation in Devil's Hollow. The equipment appeared to have been abandoned for decades, possibly dating back to Prohibition. We recommended the site be cleaned up and monitored for future illegal activity. We never mentioned the ghosts. We never mentioned the cursed moonshine or the trapped souls. Who would have believed us? And more importantly, what good would it have done? The ATF sent a cleanup crew to remove the broken stills and test the area for environmental contamination. They found traces of chemicals in the soil that couldn't be identified, so the hollow was declared a potential hazard zone and closed to public access. Agent Mitchell transferred to the Denver field office 2 months later. She said the mountain air didn't agree with her anymore. I never told her what I suspected, that she could still feel the echo of Emma McCoy's rage somewhere in the back of her mind, and it scared her. For me, I put in for a transfer to Fire Prevention Services. I couldn't handle law enforcement anymore, couldn't stand the thought of walking into another situation where people's hatred had festered into something unnatural. I spent the next 10 years watching for forest fires and trying not to think about what I'd seen in that hollow. But the story doesn't end there. Over the years, I started hearing reports from other parts of Appalachia, places where hikers found illegal stills that ran themselves, valleys where federal agents encountered moonshine operations that had no living operators, caves where the sound of gunfire echoed for decades after the last feuds had ended. Most of these reports got buried in federal files, dismissed as the imagination of city agents who spent too much time listening to local ghost stories. But I recognized the pattern. The specific details that marked places where hatred had become strong enough to outlive death itself. I started keeping a map. Red pins for confirmed supernatural distilleries, yellow pins for probable cases, green pins for locations that showed the warning signs. By the time I retired, I had over 60 pins scattered across 7 states. The thing about hatred is that it's contagious. It spreads from person to person, family to family, generation to generation. Most of the time, it eventually burns itself out as people choose forgiveness over revenge. But sometimes, especially in isolated places where old wounds never heal, it can become something more. Punished, that refuse to die even when the people carrying it are dead and buried. I live in Florida now, far from the mountains where I spent most of my life. But I still get calls sometimes. Forest rangers who found things they can't explain. Federal agents who stumble across operations that shouldn't exist. Local sheriffs who need someone to talk to about cases that don't make it into official reports. I always listen. I always believe them. And when I can, I try to help. Because I learned something important in Devil's Hollow that September day in 1987. Evil isn't always some outside force that invades our world. Sometimes it's just human hatred that's been left to fester so long it develops a life of its own. And the only way to stop it is to choose something else. Forgiveness, understanding, the kind of love that's strong enough to let go of old wounds and old grudges. Most people are capable of making that choice, even after death. But for those who aren't, for the spirits who cling to their hatred like a drowning man clings to driftwood, there's nothing left but endless war against an enemy that stopped caring about the fight long ago. I drove through Kentucky. I took a detour past Devil's Hollow. The trailhead is still closed to public access, still marked with federal warning signs about soil contamination. But sometimes, on certain nights when the wind is just right, you can still smell moonshine drifting out of that narrow valley. And if you listen carefully, you can still hear voices arguing about territory and family honor and who has the right to make corn liquor on land that belongs to the dead. Sufusal really never end. They just wait in the dark for new souls to add fuel to fires that should have burned out decades ago. Ever hiking in Appalachian country and you smell that sweet scent of fermenting mash, turn around and walk away. Don't investigate. Don't try to find the source. Some family traditions are better left buried with the people who started them. And some thirsts should never be satisfied, no matter how clear and tempting the moonshine looks dripping from the coil. Because once you taste it, you become part of the family. Forever. My name is Margaret Steelwater, and I've been a park ranger for 11 years. I work in the Allegheny National Forest in Pennsylvania, where the mountains are scarred with old coal mines. My job is to help heal the land after the mining companies are done with it. I know these mountains like the back of my hand. I've supervised the cleanup of 15 abandoned mine sites, testing soil, planting trees, making sure the water is clean again. It's dirty work, but somebody has to do it. The mining companies take what they want and leave us to fix the mess. Police think I got into this work because I love nature. That's only part of it. The real reason is more personal. 23 years ago, when I was 14, my father and 2 uncles died in a mine collapse over in Somerset County. The company said it was an accident. My family knew better. Dad had been complaining about loose ceiling supports for weeks. The foreman told him to keep working or find another job. After the funeral, I promised myself I'd never let the mining companies get away with that kind of thing again. I got my engineering degree, specialized in environmental cleanup, and came to work for the Forest Service. Every time I restore a mining site, I'm keeping that promise. It was February 1976 when I got the call about Black Diamond Mine. The weather was brutal. A blizzard had been dumping snow for 3 days straight, and the temperature hadn't been above 0 in a week. The mine had been abandoned since 1954, after a cave-in killed 47 men. Now the Forest Service wanted to turn it into a memorial park. "We need you to do a full environmental assessment," my supervisor told me over the crackling phone line. The ice storm had knocked down half the phone lines in the county. A survey team went out there last week and never came back. Their truck was found empty on the access road. I packed my gear, soil testing kits, air quality monitors, maps, and emergency supplies. The drive to Black Diamond Mine took me through some of the most depressing country in Pennsylvania. Strip mines had torn the tops off mountains, leaving behind grey scars that looked like wounds in the earth. Rusty mining equipment sat abandoned in the snow, like the skeletons of giant insects. The access road to Black Diamond Mine was barely passable. My truck slipped and slid on the ice, and twice I had to get out and push fallen branches out of the way. When I finally reached the mine site, the first thing that hit me was how quiet it was. Not just regular quiet. This was the kind of silence that comes after an explosion, when your ears are still ringing, and you're not sure if you're alive or dead. The mine entrance was a black hole in the side of the mountain, sealed with concrete and steel bars. A rusty sign hung crooked on the fence. "Danger. Keep out. Unstable structure." Snow had drifted against the fence, making it look like the mountain was trying to bury the whole ugly mess. I self and started taking readings. The air smelled wrong. Not just cold and clean like it should in the mountains, but with an undertone of something else. Coal dust, maybe, though that didn't make sense. The mine had been sealed for over 20 years. That's when I found the survey team's equipment. It was arranged in a perfect line, leading from the mine entrance to where their truck had been parked. GPS units, soil samples, measuring tape, all laid out neat as you please. But here's the thing that made my skin crawl. The equipment spelled out words in the snow, big, clear letters made from metal tools and sample containers. Remember us. I stood there staring at those words, my breath making clouds in the frigid air. The survey team couldn't have done this. Their equipment had been found scattered all over the site. And who would take the time to arrange tools in the snow before abandoning their truck and walking into a blizzard? I tried my radio but got nothing but static. The nearest town was 25 miles away, and with the roads like they were, it might as well have been on the moon. I was completely alone. That's when I heard the first sound from inside the sealed mine. It sounded like someone tapping metal on rock. Slow, steady, rhythmic, like a pickaxe hitting coal. I stood there listening to that impossible sound, telling myself it had to be something else. Water dripping, maybe, or the old support beams settling. Abandoned mines make all kinds of noises as they slowly collapse. But deep down, I knew what I was hearing. I'd grown up around miners. I knew the sound of a pickaxe hitting coal face, the rhythm of men working deep underground. The problem was, this mine had been sealed tight since 1954. Nobody could be working inside. I checked my air quality monitor. The readings were all over the place, methane levels jumping up and down like a yo-yo. That was impossible too. Methane gas builds up slowly in abandoned mines. It doesn't spike and drop every few seconds. I walked along the fence line, looking for any sign of how the survey team might have gotten inside. The concrete seal looked solid, with no cracks or holes. The steel bars were rusted, but intact. There was no way in. The tapping stopped. In the sudden silence, I heard something else. Singing. Faint and muffled, like voices coming from very far away. I pressed my ear against the fence, and the sound got a little clearer. It was an old mining song, one I remembered my father humming when he came home from work. Down in the mine where the sun don't shine, working for the company dollar. My blood ran cold. I knew that song. Every mining family in Pennsylvania knew it. But nobody had worked this mine in 22 years. I backed away from the fence, my heart pounding. There had to be a logical explanation. Sound could travel funny underground. Maybe I was hearing voices from another mine, miles away, carried through old tunnels. But even as I told myself that, I didn't believe it. I decided to set up camp and wait until morning. Maybe the storm would clear, and I could get a radio signal, call for backup. I pitched my tent in the clearing where the survey team's truck had been found, as far from the mine entrance as I could get, while still keeping it in sight. As darkness fell, the temperature dropped even further. I heated a can of soup on my camp stove and tried to make sense of what I'd seen. The arranged equipment, the impossible sounds, the crazy instrument readings. There had to be a connection. I pulled out the file on Black Diamond Mine and read it by flashlight. The 1954 disaster had been bad, even by mining standards. 47 men killed when the main tunnel collapsed. The official report blamed it on geological instability, but the newspaper articles told a different story. They'd been complaining about loose ceiling supports for months. They'd filed formal safety reports with the company. The mine inspector had recommended shutting down that section until repairs could be made. But coal prices were high, and the company owners decided to keep working. When the tunnel finally came down, it buried the men so deep they never recovered all the bodies. 15 families never got to bury their dead. I was reading about the failed rescue attempts when I heard footsteps in the snow. Slow, heavy steps, like someone wearing work boots, coming from the direction of the mine. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it toward the sound. The beam cut through the darkness, but I couldn't see anyone. The footsteps kept coming, getting closer. "Hello?" I called out. "Is someone there?" The footsteps stopped. I waited, barely breathing, listening so hard my ears hurt. Nothing. Just the wind through the bare trees and the soft patter of snow hitting my tent. Then I saw the light. It was small and yellow, bobbing through the trees like someone carrying a lantern, or a miner's helmet lamp. It moved in the jerky, swaying way lights do when someone's walking over rough ground. I watched it come closer, my mouth dry with fear. When it was about 50 feet away, I called out again. "Hey, over here!" The light stopped moving. It hung there in the darkness, perfectly still, pointed right at me. I could feel whoever was holding it staring at me, though I couldn't see anything except that yellow glow. We stayed like that for what felt like an hour, but was probably only a few seconds. Then the light turned and started moving away, back toward the mine. I should have followed it. That would have been the smart thing to do. Find out who was out there, make sure they were okay in the storm. But something kept me frozen in place. Something about the way that light moved, too smooth and steady, like it was floating instead of being carried. The light disappeared into the trees near the mine entrance. A few seconds later, I heard the tapping sound again, metal on rock, steady and rhythmic. I spent the rest of the night huddled in my sleeping bag, listening to that impossible sound and trying to convince myself I was imagining things. But when morning came and I crawled out of my tent, I found fresh footprints in the snow. Boot prints, leading from the mine entrance to where I'd seen the light. But here's what made my skin crawl. The prints went right up to where the light had stopped, then just disappeared. No return tracks, nothing. Like whoever made them had simply vanished into thin air. I spent the morning trying to explain away what I'd seen. The footprints could have been old ones, covered and uncovered by the shifting snow. The light could have been a reflection, maybe sunlight bouncing off a piece of broken glass in the trees. The sounds from the mine could have been settling timbers or water moving through old pipes. But I didn't believe any of it. Radioed the Forest Service office, but the storm was still interfering with signals. All I got was static and broken fragments of conversation from truckers on the interstate 50 miles away. I was on my own until the weather cleared. Environmental survey first, mysterious lights and phantom miners second. I set up my equipment and started taking soil samples around the mine site. The readings were all wrong. Coefficients joule levels in the soil were through the roof, like the mine was actively producing coal debris. But that was impossible. The mine had been sealed for over 20 years. Any coal dust should have washed away or been covered by new soil. I collected a dozen different spots, thinking my equipment was malfunctioning. But every reading was the same. Fresh coal dust, lots of it, like someone had been dumping it on the ground. That's when I found the lunch pail. It was sitting on a tree stump about 30 feet from the mine entrance, like someone had just set it down for a break. A black metal lunchbox, old-fashioned style, with J. Kowalski scratched into the lid. While metal was rusted, but not completely corroded. And when I opened it, I found a thermos of coffee that was still warm. My hands were shaking as I unscrewed the thermos cap. The coffee smelled fresh, like it had been poured that morning. But that was impossible. The mine had been abandoned since 1954. Even if someone had been here recently, who would bring an antique lunch pail and leave it sitting on a stump in a snowstorm? I was still staring at the lunch pail when I heard the voice. "Hey, you okay out there?" I spun around and saw a man trudging through the snow toward me. He was wearing a Forest Service uniform and carrying a backpack full of equipment. Medium height, stocky build, with grey hair under his ranger hat. "Frank Kowalski," he said, extending a gloved hand. "Mine safety inspector. Got word.
There might be trouble out here."
I shook his hand, relief flooding through me. I wasn't alone anymore. "Margaret Steelwater, how did you get here? The roads are barely passable." "Deportation," he said, pointing toward the trees. "Figured you might need backup after that survey team went missing. Any sign of them?" I showed him the arranged equipment spelling out, "Remember us," and told him about the sounds from the mine. I didn't mention the light or the footprints. I wanted to see if he experienced anything strange on his own. Frank examined the lunch pail with interest. "Kowalski," he said, reading the name. "That's Polish. A lot of Polish miners worked these mountains back in the day." He looked at me with raised eyebrows. "Including me. My grandfather worked this very mine." "When did he die?" I asked. 1954, Frank said quietly, "in the cave-in." We stared at each other for a moment, the implications sinking in. Frank's grandfather's lunch pail, sitting here in the snow after 22 years, still warm. "Mine seal," Frank said. "Make sure nobody's found a way inside." We walked to the entrance together. Frank ran his hands along the concrete, looking for cracks or weak spots. The seal looked solid, but when he pressed his ear against it, his expression changed. "Listen," he whispered. "Bathrooms." I put my ear to the concrete. The sound was clearer here, rhythmic tapping, like multiple pickaxes working at once. And underneath that, the low murmur of men's voices, too muffled to make out words. "How is that possible?" I asked. Before Frank could answer, we heard a grinding sound from somewhere deep inside the mine, like heavy machinery starting up, or massive stone blocks shifting position. Polarization, the ground under our feet began to vibrate. "Get back!" Frank yelled, grabbing my arm. We stumbled away from the entrance just as a section of ground about 10 feet to our left suddenly collapsed. It opened up like a sinkhole, revealing a perfectly round shaft leading down into darkness. The edges were smooth and clean, like a hole had been cut with a giant drill. Indifferent and I stared at the opening in shock. It hadn't been there 5 minutes ago. The ground had been solid snow over frozen dirt. "Could be old mine tunnels," Frank said, but his voice was shaky. "Sometimes they collapse and open new holes." He pulled out a powerful flashlight and shined it down the shaft. The beam revealed a tunnel extending horizontally into the mountain, with wooden support timbers that looked fresh and new. "I'm going down," he said. "That's crazy. It could collapse again. Someone might be trapped down there. It's my job." Before I could stop him, Frank was lowering himself into the hole. He had a rope and climbing gear. Mine safety inspectors always came prepared for underground emergencies. I watched his helmet light disappear into the tunnel. "Everything looks stable," his voice echoed up from below. "The timbers are in good shape, better than they should be after 20 years. Unprotected, lost sight of his light as he moved deeper into the tunnel. For several minutes I could hear him moving around down there, testing the air, checking the walls. Then he started screaming, "Get me out of here! Get me out!" I heard the sound of running footsteps, then a tremendous crash, like heavy beams falling. Frank's voice was cut off abruptly. "But Frank! Frank!" No answer. My own rope and climbed down into the shaft. The tunnel was darker than anything I'd ever experienced. My flashlight beam seemed to get swallowed up by the blackness. The air smelled like coal dust and something else, something rotten and old. Confiscated Frank about 50 feet into the tunnel. He was unconscious, pinned under a fallen support beam. Both his legs were bent at wrong angles. Fresh blood pooled around his head. But here's what really scared me. The beam that had fallen on him was brand new. The wood was fresh cut, still oozing sap, and carved into the timber in neat block letters were the words, "Remember us," or "Join us." I managed to drag Frank back to the shaft opening, but there was no way I could get him up the rope with 2 broken legs. He was in and out of consciousness, mumbling about lights moving through solid rock and voices calling his grandfather's name. I climbed back up and radioed for help, finally getting a weak signal through to the Forest Service. The rescue helicopter couldn't fly in the storm, but they promised to send a snowmobile team as soon as possible. 6 hours minimum. Frank and I were on our own. I made him as comfortable as I could with blankets and pain medication from my first aid kit. While I worked, he told me what he'd seen in the tunnel. They were there, he whispered. All of them. 47 miners, still working. I could see their helmet lights moving along the walls. When they turned around, he shuddered. Their faces were all wrong, like they'd been crushed and put back together. It was just hallucinations from the head injury, I said, but my voice didn't sound convinced. No, they spoke to me. Said they've been waiting for someone from the company to come back. Someone to pay for what happened. You don't work for the mining company, Frank. Neither do I. Doesn't matter. We work for the government now. The government that let the company get away with murder. They want justice, Margaret. They want someone to remember their names and tell the world what really happened here. As if responding to his words, the tapping sounds from the mine got louder, and for the first time, I could make out individual voices in the murmur. Men calling out names. John Kowalski, Mike Wojcik, Tony Castellano, Pete Novak. The names of the dead, I realized. They were calling roll, the way miners did at the start of each shift. Around the mine entrance started dropping. Not just cold. This was an unnatural chill that cut through my heavy coat like it was made of paper. My breath came out in thick clouds, and frost began forming on the metal fence. That's when I saw them. They came out of the mine entrance like shadows becoming solid. 47 figures in old-fashioned mining clothes, carrying lunch pails and pickaxes. Their helmet lights cast crazy dancing shadows on the snow. Clinging, depending their faces clearly, but I could tell something was wrong with them. They moved too stiffly, like their bones were broken and healed wrong. Coal dust fell from their clothes with every step, leaving black trails in the white snow. They formed a circle around the shaft where Frank was lying. Their leader, a tall man with foreman stitched on his jacket, stepped forward. "You know why we're here," he said. His voice sounded like rocks grinding together. "The cave-in," I whispered. "You want people to know it wasn't an accident." 47 good men died because the company chose profit over safety. The government inspector was paid to look the other way. The newspapers printed lies about geological instability. The foreman's helmet light flickered as he spoke. "We've been waiting 22 years for someone to tell the truth." "What about the survey team?" "They ran, like all the others who came before. But you're different. You understand what it means to lose family to corporate greed." He was right. I did understand. The same companies that had killed these men had killed my father and uncles. They were still out there, cutting corners and buying off inspectors, and hiding behind lawyers when people died. "What do you want from me?" "Familiarity. Build a memorial. Tell our story. Put our names on the record so our families know we didn't die for nothing." The foreman gestured to the other miners. "Do this, and we'll rest. Refuse, and you'll stay here with us. Forever." The circle of miners stepped closer. I could see their faces now in the helmet lights. Crushed skulls, broken jaws, eyes full of coal dust and rage. They'd been trapped underground for over 20 years, forgotten by everyone except their families. But something about their demand bothered me. "No, no, why haven't you done this before? Other people have been here. Government inspectors, surveyors, hunters. Why wait for me?" Beform's shattered face twisted into what might have been a smile. "Because you have the power to make them listen. You work for the Forest Service. You can make this an official memorial site. You can get the real story in the government records." He was right again. As the lead environmental engineer on this project, my recommendations would carry weight. If I said this site needed to be a memorial instead of a park, they'd listen. "There's more," Frank whispered from the shaft. "Tell her about the others." Foreman's helmet light swung toward Frank, then back to me. "He's right. We're not the only ones. Every mining disaster in these mountains has left spirits behind. Dozens of sites, hundreds of dead miners, all waiting for someone to tell their stories. Roofing became a cold wind. If I did what they wanted, I'd be opening the door for every mining disaster spirit in Pennsylvania. Every covered-up accident, every safety violation that led to deaths, every family that never got justice. If I didn't. Miners stepped closer, their pickaxes gleaming in the helmet lights. The temperature dropped another 10 degrees. Frost began forming on my eyelashes. "Choose," the foreman said. I looked down at Frank, bleeding and broken. I thought about my father, crushed under tons of rock because his bosses cared more about coal than human lives. I thought about 47 families who'd never learned the real reason their husbands and sons died. "I'll do it," I said. "I'll build your memorial and tell your story. All of your stories." The foreman nodded slowly. "Then our work here is finished." The less the miners began to fade, becoming transparent, then just wisps of coal dust blowing in the wind. As they disappeared, the unnatural cold lifted. The tapping sounds from the mine stopped. Conflicting, the foreman was the last to go. "Rorska us," he said, and then he was gone. Rescue team found us 2 hours later. They airlifted Frank to the hospital in Pittsburgh, where he eventually recovered, though he still walks with a cane. He never talked publicly about what we experienced at Black Diamond Mine, but he backed up every word of my official report. I recommended that the site be developed as the Black Diamond Memorial Park, with a monument listing all 47 names of the miners who died in 1954. I also recommended a full investigation into the original disaster. The investigation took 6 months. What they found was worse than I'd expected. The mining company executives had known about the safety problems for over a year. They had engineers' reports recommending immediate repairs to the tunnel supports. They had workers' complaints documented in company files. They even had a memo from the mine foreman, the same man whose spirit had spoken to me, warning that the tunnel would collapse if they didn't stop production and fix the ceiling. Nevertheless, the company chose to keep mining. Coal prices were at a 15-year high, and they didn't want to lose production time. When the tunnel finally collapsed, they destroyed all the safety reports and paid the government inspector to blame geological instability. None of the executives were still alive to face charges, but the families of the dead miners finally got their answers. More importantly, the evidence we found led to new federal mine safety regulations that have saved hundreds of lives over the past 30 years. The Black Diamond Memorial was dedicated on the 23rd anniversary of the Black disaster. 15 families who had never been able to bury their dead finally had a place to grieve. The monument lists every name, along with the words, "They died not from nature's violence, but from corporate greed. Remember them and honor their sacrifice by demanding better." At Black Diamond was just the beginning. Suppressing, word spread through the mining communities about what we'd found. Families started coming forward with their own stories of covered-up disasters, safety violations, and loved ones who died in accidents that weren't accidents at all. I've spent the last 5 years investigating mining disasters across Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Kentucky. Each site tells the same story. Companies that put profits before people, government inspectors who looked the other way, and families who never got the truth about how their loved ones died. When the investigation gets close to the truth, I hear them. The tapping of pickaxes, the voices of dead miners calling out their names, the spirits of men who died for someone else's greed, still waiting for justice. I've learned that the dead don't rest easy when they're forgotten. They don't rest easy when their deaths are covered up or explained away or blamed on things beyond human control. They stay active, waiting for someone to care enough to dig up the truth. Frank and I are that someone. We've become unofficial advocates for mining disaster families, using our government positions to force investigations and demand accountability. It's dangerous work. Mining companies have long memories and deep pockets. But every time I'm tempted to quit, I remember the foreman's words. remember us. The spirits at Black Diamond Mine have been quiet since the memorial was built. But on February nights when the wind is strong, hikers sometimes report hearing singing from deep inside the mountain. Old mining songs, sung by voices that echo with satisfaction and peace. They're at rest now, but there are dozens of other sites where the dead are still waiting, still tapping on rock with phantom pickaxes, still calling out the names of their fellow miners, still waiting for someone to remember them and tell their stories. My name is Margaret Steelwater, and I've been a park ranger for 16 years. I work in the mountains of Appalachia, where the dead don't rest easy and the living still fight for justice. And I've learned that sometimes the only way to put the past to rest is to dig it up and force the world to look at it, even when it's buried under tons of rock and 20 years of lies, even when it's guarded by the angry spirits of men who died before their time, even when remembering the truth means facing the uncomfortable fact that some tragedies aren't acts of God or nature, they're acts of greed and negligence, and the simple, terrible decision to value money more than human life. The mountains remember every scar we carve into them, and the dead remember every promise we break. Remember them, honor their sacrifice, and demand better from those who hold our lives in their hands. Because if we don't, they'll keep tapping on stone and calling out names until someone finally listens.